For thousands of years, Zen masters have known something about peace that the rest of us were never taught. They did not write it down as complicated philosophy. They kept it in simple stories, plain enough to reach the heart without explanation. Tonight, we will walk through some of these stories together. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Everything you hear tonight points to the same quiet truth. The peace we want most was never far away. It is available right here, in this very room, in this very breath. Nothing needs to be memorized, and nothing needs to be understood perfectly. Settle into whatever position feels most comfortable, and let your breath find its own slow rhythm. If sleep takes you before the final story, the words will keep working long after you stop listening. Thank you for joining us here at Midnight Monk. Let us begin. Taro had been a potter for most of his adult life. His workshop sat at the edge of a small village, and for years he had built a reputation for producing fine, delicate bowls and cups that merchants came from distant towns to buy. He was proud of his craft and proud of the modest living it provided for his family. 6 months earlier, Taro had made a mistake that still kept him awake most nights. He had misjudged the temperature of his kiln during a large and important firing. The heat had climbed too high, and by morning, an entire season's work lay cracked and ruined inside the kiln walls. The clay had split and buckled. Glazes that should have turned a soft blue had blistered into something ugly and unsaleable. Weeks of careful shaping, trimming, and glazing, all of it destroyed in a single night. The loss was severe. Taro had already promised the pieces to a merchant who had paid in advance, and he was forced to return the money he had already spent. His savings vanished. His reputation suffered. He began to wonder whether he had ever been a competent potter at all, or whether the years of success had simply been luck that had finally run out. Sleep became difficult. Each night, Taro would lie in the dark replaying the firing, adjusting the vents in his mind, checking the temperature he should have checked, making the correction he had failed to make. The scene played over and over, always ending the same way, with the cracked and ruined bowls staring back at him in the grey morning light. Hearing of a gardener named Haru who lived simply in the hills and was known for his uncommon wisdom, Taro decided to make the walk up to see him. He arrived in the late afternoon and found Haru kneeling among rows of vegetables, pulling weeds with slow, steady hands. Haru welcomed him warmly and offered tea. They sat on a low bench beside the garden, while the afternoon light moved through the trees. "I have come because I cannot find peace," Taro said. "6 months ago, I destroyed an entire firing through carelessness. I lost everything I had been working toward. Every night since, my mind goes back to that kiln, checking the vents I did not check, making the corrections I failed to make. The same scene, over and over, and I cannot make it stop." Haru listened without interrupting. When Taro finished, the gardener sat with the silence for a while. Then came a simple question. "This firing that troubles you, where is it right now?" Taro frowned. "What do you mean?" "The kiln that cracked your bowls," Haru said. "The heat that climbed too high. Where is all of that at this moment?" "It happened 6 months ago. It is in my memory." "Ah," Haru said. "So the firing itself is finished. The kiln has cooled. The clay has been cleared away. What remains is a thought about a thing that no longer exists. But the consequences are real, Taro protested. I lost my savings. I damaged my reputation. Those effects are still with me today. Haru nodded. Yes, your savings are smaller today than they once were. Some people may think less of your work. These are present facts, and present facts can be met with present action. But the firing itself, that single night when the heat rose too high, that moment is gone. You cannot reach it. You cannot change it. Yet you return to it every night as though it were still happening. Taro sat quietly, feeling the weight of this. Every morning, Haru continued, I come out to this garden and it is new. Last night's frost, yesterday's rain, they have already done whatever they were going to do. I cannot undo the frost. I can only tend what is here now. If I spent my mornings mourning yesterday's weather, nothing would ever get planted. But how do I stop the memory from returning? Taro asked. It comes on its own. I do not invite it. You may not invite the memory, Haru replied gently, but you do offer it a seat. When it arrives, you sit down with it, you serve it tea, you listen to its complaints for hours. What if, instead, you simply noticed it at the door and let it pass? Taro considered this. But it feels so real when it comes back. It feels like I am standing in front of the kiln again, watching everything crack apart. Of course it feels real, Haru said. Memory is very convincing. But feelings are not the same as facts. Right now, at this very moment, you are sitting in a garden. The air is cool. The tea is warm. Your hands are empty and your kiln is cold. That is what is real. The rest is a story your mind is telling you about a night that has already passed. That night, Taro slept at the gardener's home on a simple mat. He found that his mind grew quieter than it had been in months. Not because the memory was gone, but because something in Haru's question had shifted his relationship to it. The firing was not happening now. It was a story his mind was telling about something that had already ended. When Taro woke in the morning, he found Haru already at work among the vegetables, staking young tomato plants, his attention resting entirely on the vine in front of him. There was no sign that the old gardener was thinking about anything other than the vine in his hands. Master Haru, Taro said, thank you for what you said last night about letting the memory pass. Haru looked up, puzzled. Last night? I am sorry. I do not recall our conversation. I have been busy with these tomatoes since first light. He smiled and turned back to his work. His whole attention had already returned to the vine in his hands, as though nothing else existed, because for him, in that moment, nothing else did. Taro stood there for a moment, then laughed softly. The old gardener was not pretending. He was simply living the way he had described, and the living itself was the lesson. Taro bowed and began the walk home with a lighter step, understanding for the first time that each moment offered him a choice between carrying the past and setting it down. Years later, whenever anyone asked Taro about the failed firing and how he had found his way back from it, he would smile and tell them, I stopped tending a garden that no longer existed and started working the soil beneath my feet. This story points to one of the most practical teachings in Zen Buddhism for those who struggle with sleep. Our minds have a habit of replaying difficult events long after they have ended. An awkward conversation from this afternoon, a mistake from last month, a regret from years ago. The mind picks each one up and turns it over as though it were still happening. What Haru helped Taro see is something simple but easy to forget. What we call the past has no home of its own. It lives only as a thought arising right now, and a thought is something you can watch arrive and watch leave. When we lie awake turning over old events, we are not actually dealing with those events. We are creating fresh suffering by giving our attention to thoughts about things that have already ended. This does not mean ignoring the lessons of experience or pretending that difficult things did not happen. Taro still had to rebuild his livelihood. He still had to face the practical consequences of his mistake. But there is a difference between addressing present circumstances and tormenting yourself with replays of a moment you can never reach again. The practice Haru suggested is not about forcing memories away. Forcing only creates more tension. Instead, it is about noticing when a memory arrives and choosing not to offer it a permanent seat. The thought comes, you see it, and you let it continue on its way. It may return again later. That is fine. You let it pass again. Over time, the visits grow shorter and less frequent, not because you fought them, but because you stopped feeding them with your attention. Tonight, as your body grows heavier, you might notice thoughts from the day arriving at the edges of your mind. Conversations you had, things left undone, small frustrations or regrets. You do not need to push them away, and you do not need to follow them into their full story. Simply notice them the way you might notice a sound outside your window. Present for a moment, then gone. The day is over. Whatever happened in it has already finished. What remains now is this quiet moment, this breath, this rest. Kenta was the wealthiest landowner in the province. His orchards stretched across 3 valleys, producing more fruit than any other estate in the region. He owned a fine house with painted screens and polished floors, employed dozens of workers, and had built his fortune through years of careful planning and relentless effort. Despite all of this, Kenta found himself strangely restless. Each harvest brought satisfaction for a few days, and then his mind would turn to the next season, the next expansion, the next piece of land he might acquire. He lay awake at night calculating yields, worrying about weather, and planning how to protect what he had already gained. His wealth grew steadily, but his peace of mind did not grow with it. A traveler passing through the province mentioned a beekeeper named Osamu who lived alone at the top of the eastern ridge. People said the old man was the most contented person anyone had ever met, though he owned almost nothing. Curious, Kenta made the climb one autumn afternoon. He found Osamu sitting beside a row of simple wooden hives, watching the bees move in and out of their entrances with the expression of someone watching something endlessly fascinating. The beekeeper's home was a single small room with a straw roof. His possessions appeared to consist of a sleeping mat, a cooking pot, a worn robe, and the hives. Osamu welcomed Kenta with a warmth that surprised him and offered him a cup of water from the spring. "I do not understand," Kenta said, once they had settled into conversation. "I have spent my life building something. I have orchards, workers, a fine home. Yet I cannot sleep peacefully, and I feel no lasting contentment. You have almost nothing, and you seem completely at ease. How is this possible?" Osamu smiled and tilted his head toward the ridge. "Tell me," he said. "Can you hear that stream?" Kenta listened. Below them, somewhere among the rocks, water was moving over stones. "Yes," he said. "I hear it. Do you own that sound?" Kenta looked puzzled. Of course not. No one owns the sound of water. Yet it is pleasant, is it not? And you are enjoying it right now, fully, without any deed or title to it. Kenta had to admit this was true. What about the warmth of the sun on your shoulders right now? Osamu continued. Do you own that? No. And the smell of the pine trees around us? The color of the sky? Kenta shook his head at each question. You are experiencing all of these things completely, Osamu said gently. Not a diminished version. Not a lesser share. The full richness of each one is available to you, and not one of them required your wealth to obtain. You see, my friend, your hands have been closed around your life. You keep trying to grip what was only ever meant to pass through open fingers. The stream, the light, the scent of pine. None of it can be held, and none of it needs to be. Kenta sat with this for a while, watching the bees work. After a long pause, he said, but surely, having comfortable things adds something real to life. A warm home in winter is better than a cold one. Certainly, Osamu agreed. There is nothing wrong with a warm home, and I would not trade my hives for anything. But there is a difference between enjoying a thing and needing to possess it before you allow yourself any enjoyment at all. A man who can only enjoy what he owns lives in a very small world, no matter how large his estate. A man who can receive what is freely given lives in a world without walls. As evening settled over the ridge, Kenta noticed something he had not felt in a very long time. He was far from his fine house, sitting on bare ground, drinking water instead of wine, and he felt full in a way that no harvest had ever left him. The fading light, the cooling air, the quiet company of a man who wanted nothing from him. Somehow these plain things held more than everything he had spent his life acquiring. Kenta noticed the bees returning to their hives as the air cooled. They moved without hesitation, each one finding its way to the narrow entrance as though drawn by something invisible. They did not seem to be in any hurry, and they did not seem to worry about tomorrow's flowers. Tell me, Kenta said, do the bees worry about whether the next field will have enough blossoms? Osamu shook his head. They go where the flowers are. When one field is finished, they find another. They do not hoard what cannot be kept, and they do not grieve what has already been gathered. Kenta was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, all these years, I thought contentment was waiting at the end of my work, but it was never ahead of me at all. It was beside me the whole time, and I never turned to look. Osamu nodded toward the fading light over the valley. You cannot bring in the evening the way you bring in a harvest, he said. It does not keep. But while it is here, it asks nothing of you except that you notice it. When Kenta returned to his estate, he found that something in his relationship with his wealth had shifted. He still managed his orchards with care, but the desperate need to acquire more had loosened its hold. He began to notice pleasures he had been walking past for years. The sound of morning birds in his orchards. The way the light fell through leaves after rain. A quiet conversation with a worker at the end of the day. His sleep improved as well. The nightly calculations quieted because there was no longer a next thing his rest depended on. Years later, when people asked Kenta about the change in him, he would say, I discovered that I had been rich my whole life. I only had to stop reaching long enough to notice. This story speaks to a pattern that many of us carry into the night without realizing it. Much of the mental activity that keeps us awake is a form of reaching. Reaching for different circumstances, reaching for solutions, reaching for security or achievement or approval. A mind in this posture cannot settle because it is always stretched towards something that is not yet here. What Osamu helped Kenta see is that contentment rarely arrives through acquiring. It arrives through receiving, which is a different movement altogether. The warmth of sunlight, the comfort of a safe place to rest, the simple fact of breathing easily. These are not prizes to be won. They are already present, waiting to be noticed. Zen teaching speaks of knowing what is enough. It is the recognition that what you already have, right here, right now, is enough. Not enough in the sense of giving up on goals or settling for less than you deserve. Enough in the sense that the present moment, taken on its own terms, already contains what you need to feel at ease. This perspective is especially useful as sleep approaches. The mind that plans for more and guards against loss can be given a different task tonight: the simple noticing of what is already here. The weight of the blanket, the temperature of the air on your face, the quiet fact of being alive and conscious in this unremarkable, perfectly sufficient moment. There is a particular kind of restlessness that comes from wanting. It is different from fear or sadness. It is the feeling of almost the sense that if you could just get one more thing settled, one more problem solved, one more piece into place, then you could finally rest. But that final piece never arrives, because the wanting mind always finds a new gap to fill. Tonight, as you lie here, you might notice this reaching quality in your own thoughts. The mind scanning for something unfinished, something incomplete, something that still needs your attention. When you notice this, you can gently ask yourself whether there is anything you truly need at this moment that you do not already have. Often the answer is no. You are warm. You are breathing. You are safe enough for now. The restless mind that keeps reaching for more finally settles when it recognizes that what it has been searching for was never far away. Like Kenta discovering that he had been rich all along, you may find that the contentment you have been working toward is not something you need to earn. It is something you have only to stop long enough to receive. Among the students of Master Nori, none struggled more with her own mind than a young calligrapher named Emi. While other students dealt with the usual challenges of learning, restless legs during sitting, difficulty concentrating, confusion about the teachings, Emi's greatest obstacle was a voice inside her own head that criticized everything she did. During calligraphy practice, this voice provided a constant commentary of disapproval. That stroke is uneven. Your hand is not steady enough. Everyone else is improving faster than you are. You will never be good enough. In meditation, the same voice followed her. You cannot sit still for even a few minutes. Your mind is too scattered. This is a waste of your time and the master's patience. The criticism extended into every part of her day. When she spilled tea during meal service, the voice called her clumsy. When she struggled with a new brushstroke, it told her she lacked talent. When she felt tired during evening practice, it told her that her weariness proved she did not want this enough. This inner harshness had not begun at the monastery. It had started in childhood with a demanding father who expressed love mainly through correction, and a mother who was rarely satisfied with anything Emi produced. Over the years, Emi had taken these voices inside herself so completely that she no longer needed anyone to criticize her from outside. She had become an expert at providing her own punishment. The painful irony was that Emmy's self-criticism came from a genuine desire to improve. She believed that being harsh with herself would push her toward better work and deeper practice. Instead, the constant mental attack was draining her energy and making progress nearly impossible. Her brush strokes grew tighter and more hesitant the harder she tried. Her meditation became a battleground rather than a refuge. Master Nori had been observing Emmy's struggle for several weeks. One afternoon, she called Emmy to her room. Instead of correcting her brushwork or adjusting her posture, Nori gave her something else entirely. For the next 7 days, Nori said, I want you to speak to yourself exactly as you would speak to a beloved younger sister on her first day with the brush. Emmy looked uncertain. I am not sure I understand, Master. If your younger sister made a mistake while learning a new brushstroke, how would you speak to her? I would tell her that mistakes are a natural part of learning, Emmy replied, without hesitation. I would encourage her to try again. And if she struggled with something difficult, would you tell her she was stupid or talentless? Emmy looked horrified. Of course not. I would tell her that difficult things take time and that she was doing well to keep trying. And on a day when she was tired and her practice went poorly, would you call her lazy? No. I would tell her that rest is important and that she should be gentle with herself. Nori nodded. 7 days, she said. Give yourself the same kindness you have just described. Whenever the critical voice speaks, ask yourself one question. Would I say this to someone I love, who is doing her best? Emmy felt doubtful. But Master, if I stop being strict with myself, will I not become careless? Will my work not suffer? Let us find out, Nori said simply. 1 week. The first day was the hardest. Emmy's habit of self-attack was so deeply carved into her thinking that catching it required constant attention. During morning calligraphy, when her brush slipped and the critical voice immediately began its familiar assault, Emmy paused and tried the new response. Instead of telling herself that she was hopeless, she thought, that stroke did not go where you intended. That happens. Try it again when you are ready. Instead of calling herself slow for not grasping a new technique, she thought, this is a complicated movement. Many people find it difficult at first. You will get it with practice. The shift in her inner atmosphere was immediate and startling. For the first time she could remember, her own mind felt like a place of shelter rather than a place of attack. Her hand relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The next stroke came out cleaner than anything she had produced in weeks, not because she tried harder, but because she had stopped fighting herself. By the 3rd day, Emmy noticed something she had not expected. Not only did she feel happier and calmer, but her actual work was improving. Her characters were more fluid, her lines more confident, and her concentration deeper. The energy she had been spending on self-attack was now available for actual practice. On the 5th day, she produced a piece of calligraphy that Master Nori held up for the entire class to see. Amy felt a warmth that was not pride in the achievement. It was the simple relief of no longer being at war with herself. At the end of the week, she reported her findings to Nori. I discovered something I did not expect, Emmy said. All those years, the harshness never once made me braver with the brush. The patience did that in a single week. And your worry that gentleness would lead to carelessness? Nori asked. Emmy laughed quietly. I had it the wrong way around. The harshness was what made me rigid and afraid. When I treated myself with patience, I was willing to take risks and try new things. My work improved because I stopped being afraid of my own judgment. Tell me, Nori continued, suppose a young student came to you one day, someone who doubted herself and spoke to herself cruelly. What would you do for her? I would remind her, as many times as she needed to hear it, that she was worth teaching, Emmy replied. Then you already know the way, Nori said. You have simply been saving your patience for everyone but yourself. From that day forward, Emmy's practice was transformed. She learned to meet self-critical thoughts the way a good teacher meets a struggling student, redirecting quietly, without adding blame to blame. Her calligraphy continued to improve, not because she became less discerning about quality, but because her discernment now stood on respect instead of fear. Years later, Emmy became known as a gifted and compassionate teacher herself, and students often asked where her method had come from. Her answer never changed. I learned to put down the whip and pick up the lamp, she would say. You cannot find your way in the dark by punishing yourself for not seeing. Emmy's story reveals a distinction that matters deeply for anyone who carries self-critical thoughts into the night. There is a real difference between honest reflection that comes from care and harsh judgment that comes from old patterns of shame. The voice that called Emmy clumsy and talentless was not actually trying to help her improve. It was repeating something learned long ago, a script from childhood, with no bearing on her present efforts or abilities. Most of us hold ourselves to a standard of speech we would never accept between two other people. If you overheard a stranger speaking to a child the way you sometimes speak to yourself, you would step in. Yet inside our own minds, this goes on unchallenged, and it creates an atmosphere of hostility that makes rest very difficult. It is hard to sleep peacefully in a room where someone is shouting at you, even when the person shouting is yourself. The experiment that Master Nori suggested is disarmingly simple. When the critical voice speaks, ask yourself, would I say this to someone I love who is doing her best? This single question can change the entire atmosphere inside your mind. It does not silence the voice, but it gives you a way to meet it with something warmer than agreement. This does not mean ignoring genuine areas for growth or avoiding responsibility for your actions. Emmy still worked hard. She still noticed when a brushstroke went wrong. The difference was in how she responded to imperfection. Her mistakes became information rather than verdicts, something to work with in the morning rather than something to be sentenced for at night. Tonight, as you lie here, you may notice the voice of self-judgment beginning its review of the day. The things you said that you wish you had said differently. The tasks left undone. The moments where you fell short of your own expectations. When this voice speaks, you do not need to argue with it, and you do not need to believe everything it says. You can simply ask yourself whether you would speak this way to someone you care about. If the answer is no, then perhaps you can offer yourself the same basic kindness you would give so freely to anyone else. The gentleness you extend to yourself is not a luxury or a reward for good behavior. It is the ground from which real rest grows. Like Emmy discovering that the whip was never making her better, you may find that the peace you have been trying to force through self-discipline arrives more naturally through self-kindness. Take a moment now to notice the simple rhythm of your breathing. Feel the gentle rise of your chest or belly and the quiet release that follows, There is nothing to adjust, nothing to improve. Your body already knows how to do this, and it has been doing it faithfully all day without your help. Let that be enough for now. Let us pause for a moment before we continue our journey together. In a small mountain school, where students came to study both meditation and traditional crafts, there lived a young weaver named Sora. She had come to the school 2 years ago, full of expectation. She imagined that learning to sit in stillness would be like learning to weave, something difficult at first that would grow easier with repetition. But 2 years had passed, and while her hands had grown sure at the loom, her mind remained as wild and scattered as the day she arrived. The problem was her mind. No matter how she tried, she could not make it hold still. During sitting meditation, her thoughts scattered in every direction. One moment she would be following her breath, and the next she would be planning tomorrow's weaving pattern, or remembering a letter from home, or worrying about whether the other students had noticed how badly she was doing. During walking meditation, the same restlessness followed her. Even at the loom, where her hands moved steadily and her body knew exactly what to do, her mind raced ahead, behind, and sideways all at once. She tried everything she could think of. She attempted to force her attention back to the breath through sheer willpower. She tried counting each exhalation but would lose track after 7 or 8. She tried to picture an empty room in her mind and hold it there, but within seconds, the room would fill with furniture, then people, then conversations. The harder she pushed for stillness, the louder her thoughts seemed to become. Other students appeared to settle into meditation without a struggle. Their faces would soften within minutes, their shoulders dropping, their breathing growing long and even. Sora would watch them with a kind of baffled envy. Her own sessions felt like trying to hold water in her fists. The tighter she gripped, the faster everything slipped through. She began to believe that something was fundamentally wrong with her, that she lacked whatever quality made a person capable of inner quiet. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session, Sora went to Master Daichi and told him she was considering leaving. "Master," she said, "I have been practicing for 2 years, and I am worse now than when I started. My mind will not cooperate. I sit down to meditate, and within a few breaths my thoughts are everywhere. I watch the other students finding peace, and I wonder what is broken in me that I cannot find it too." Daichi listened to all of this without interruption. When Sora finished, he asked her something she did not expect. "When your thoughts are racing and scattered, who notices that they are racing?" Sora paused. "I do. I notice it constantly. It is all I notice." "And this noticing," Daichi said, "is it also scattered? Is the part of you that sees the restlessness itself restless?" Sora had never thought about this. She sat with the question for a moment. "No," she said slowly. "The noticing is steady. It sees the chaos, but it is not chaotic." Daichi waited. "It is more like standing in a quiet room," Sora continued, "looking out through a window at a storm. The storm is real, but the room is untouched by it." Daichi nodded. "You have been staring through that window for 2 years, upset about the weather. But you have never once turned around to look at the room you are standing in. I do not understand. You have been trying to change what awareness sees," Daichi explained. "Calm thoughts instead of busy ones. Stillness instead of movement. But awareness itself, the seeing that is always here. It does not need what it sees to be any particular way. It is already calm, whether the thoughts it watches are calm or not. But what about the noise? Sora asked. All the thoughts, the planning, the worrying? What about it? Daichi replied. Does a mirror suffer when it reflects a storm? Does a lake become the clouds that move across its surface? Sora sat quietly for a long time. Something was shifting in her that she could not quite name. You have been sitting perfectly this whole time, Daichi said gently. You have simply been measuring your practice by the wrong thing. You kept watching the weather and forgetting the sky. The following morning, Sora returned to her cushion with a different orientation. When her thoughts scattered, as they did almost immediately, she did not chase them or fight them. Instead, she turned her attention toward whatever it was that could see the scattering happening. It was subtle at first, like becoming aware of the silence between two notes rather than the notes themselves. But it was there, steady, open, undisturbed by the mental activity passing through it. At the loom that afternoon, she noticed it again. Her hands moved the shuttle, her feet worked the pedals, her mind planned the next row of the pattern, and behind all of this activity, something watched without participating. Something that had been there every day she had woven, every night she had struggled, and she had simply never thought to look for it. Over the weeks that followed, Sora's relationship with her own mind changed entirely. The thoughts did not stop. Some days they were louder than ever. But she no longer measured her practice by their volume or frequency. She had found something underneath them that did not require fixing or improvement, and resting there felt like coming home to a room she had lived in all along without ever noticing its walls. When newer students came to Sora struggling with the same frustrations she had carried, she would tell them, "Stop staring at the weather and look for what the weather is moving through. That is where your rest has been waiting." This story addresses something that troubles many people, not just in meditation, but in the hours before sleep. We assume that a busy mind is a problem to be solved, and that peace can only arrive once our thoughts have been quieted. This assumption turns rest into a project, something we must accomplish through effort and control, and the effort itself keeps us awake. What Daichi showed Sora is that there is something in us that is already at rest, even when our thoughts are active. This awareness, the simple fact of noticing, does not need a particular kind of thought in order to be peaceful. It observes busy thinking and calm thinking with the same steadiness. It is like the sky behind every kind of weather, unchanged by what passes through it. This means that a quiet mind is not a requirement for rest. You do not need to solve the puzzle of your thoughts before you are allowed to sleep. The awareness that is noticing your thinking right now is already still. It has been still through every thought you have had today, through every worry, every plan, every moment of frustration. It did not leave when your mind was busy, and it will not arrive when your mind is calm. It has been here the whole time. This is not a technique you need to master or a special state you need to achieve. It is more like remembering something you already know. You have been aware your entire life. That awareness has been present through every mood, every worry, every stretch of boredom, and every flash of joy. It did not arrive with your good days, and it will not leave with the difficult ones. It simply watches, the way a lake reflects whatever passes above it without being marked by any of it. Tonight, if you notice your mind producing thoughts as you lie here, you do not need to treat this as a failure or an obstacle. You can let the thoughts do what they do and turn your attention gently toward the noticing itself. not toward any particular thing you are noticing, but toward the simple fact that noticing is happening at all. This quiet seeing is where rest already lives. It does not need your thoughts to stop before it can hold you. Riku had been a student at Master Goro's monastery, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by fruit orchards in the foothills, for nearly a year. And for all of that time, he had been at war with his own practice. Each morning, Riku approached sitting meditation the way he approached every challenge, with determination and force. He held his back rigid, locked his gaze on a spot on the floor, and clamped down on every thought that tried to surface. When his concentration wandered, he dragged it back. When his body wanted to shift, he refused it permission. He treated meditation as a contest between his will and his mind, and he was determined to win. The result was the opposite of what he intended. By the end of each session, his shoulders ached from tension, his jaw was sore from clenching, and his mind buzzed with frustration. He felt more agitated after sitting than before. Other students seemed to soften during practice, while Riku hardened. His afternoons were spent working in the monastery orchard, pruning branches and clearing weeds around the fruit trees. He brought the same forceful approach to this work, pulling at stubborn roots, hacking at dead wood with more energy than precision, and becoming irritated when the orchard did not bend easily to his plans. One morning, after a session that left him with a headache and a feeling of complete failure, Riku approached Master Goro. "Master," he said, "I have been doing everything I can. I sit with perfect discipline. I force my attention back to the breath again and again. But instead of finding peace, I find only tension. My practice is getting worse, not better." Goro listened, then asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Tell me something," Goro said. "When you lie down at night and try very hard to fall asleep, what happens?" Riku stopped. The question seemed unrelated, but the answer was obvious. "I stay awake," he said. "The effort keeps me alert. My mind will not let go. And on the nights when sleep does come easily, what are you doing differently?" Riku thought about this. "Nothing," he said. "I am not doing anything. I stop holding on, and sleep arrives without my help." Goro let this sit between them for a moment. "Your meditation is built on the same mistake," he said. "You believe that peace is something your effort can produce. So you grip tighter and tighter, and the gripping itself becomes the disturbance. You are squeezing the fruit to make it ripen." Riku glanced toward the orchard visible through the window. "Does a pear ripen faster if you pull on it?" Goro asked. "No. It ripens when conditions are right. Warmth, rain, and time. And the tree," Goro continued. "Does it clench its branches to hurry the blossoms? Does it strain to push the fruit along? No. The tree does what a tree does. It does not struggle with itself. Yet it is not idle," Goro said. "Right now, at this moment, every tree in this orchard is drawing water through its roots, turning its leaves to catch the light, moving sweetness through its wood. There is enormous effort in that tree, but it is effort without force, activity without fighting." That afternoon, Goro changed the terms of Riku's practice entirely. For one full week, he was not to try to meditate at all. Instead, he was simply to sit and notice what was already happening, without attempting to change anything or reach any particular state. Riku felt uneasy about this. After months of effort, the idea of not trying felt like giving up. But his current approach had led him nowhere useful, so he agreed to the experiment. The next morning, instead of locking his posture into place, he sat in whatever way felt natural and let his body settle on its own. Instead of clamping down on his thoughts, he watched them the way he might watch leaves drifting on a pond. He did not chase them, and he did not push them under. He simply sat and observed. What happened surprised him. Without the constant pressure of his effort, something in him began to unclench. His breath found a rhythm on its own, deeper and slower than anything he had been able to force. His muscles let go of tension he had not known he was carrying. And his mind surprised him most of all. Left alone, it behaved like a pond after the stick is laid down. The stirred-up cloudiness had never needed to be removed. It only needed to stop being stirred, and it sank away by itself. 7 days later, Riku sat with Goro and described what had happened. He had found more genuine stillness in 1 week of allowing than in the entire year of forcing that came before it. When he described this to Goro, the teacher nodded. Now you know the difference between tending a garden and pulling at the roots to see if anything is growing. From that point forward, Riku's practice changed completely. He learned to create conditions for stillness rather than manufacturing stillness through force. His time in the orchard changed too. He pruned with patience instead of hacking, cleared weeds without resentment, and began to notice how much the trees accomplished through no effort he could see. When newer students arrived at the school already gripping their practice like a fist around a stone, Riku would sit with them and say, "Open your hand. What you are looking for is not something you can hold. It is something that lands when your fingers are no longer closed." This story draws a line between two kinds of effort that are easy to confuse. There is effort that creates conditions and effort that tries to force results. A gardener who waters, weeds, and tends the soil is making effort. A gardener who digs up seeds every morning to check if they are sprouting is also making effort. Only one of these leads to a garden. Many of us bring the second kind of effort to bed. We try to relax, which is itself a form of tension. We monitor whether we are falling asleep, which keeps us alert. We attempt to silence our thinking, which gives the mind one more task to stay busy with. The trying becomes the obstacle. The parallel with falling asleep is one of the most useful things Zen practice points to, because sleep is something nearly everyone has experienced arriving on its own. You cannot will yourself to sleep any more than you can will a fruit to ripen. What you can do is create the right conditions: a dark room, a comfortable position, a willingness to let go, and then step out of the way. This stepping out is not laziness or passivity. It takes a real kind of courage to stop managing a process and trust that it knows what to do without your supervision. There is a part of the mind that believes nothing good happens unless it is watched, pushed, and checked on. That part means well. It has simply never noticed how much of life runs beautifully without it. Your heart beats unsupervised. Your lungs fill and empty without a schedule. Your body has been falling asleep successfully for your entire life, and it does not need your conscious direction to find its way into rest tonight. It only needs you to stop interfering. As you lie here now, you might notice places where you are still holding on. A jaw that is slightly clenched. Shoulders that have not fully released. A mind that is still checking to see whether sleep has arrived yet. You do not need to force these things open. Simply noticing them is often enough. Like the pond in Riku's practice, your mind does not need you to remove its cloudiness. It only needs you to set the stick down. The monastery garden at Master Fumi's school held a large stone pond fed by a narrow channel from the hillside above. The pond was home to several fish, a few frogs, and one very old tortoise named Bhutan, who had lived there for longer than any of the current students or teachers could remember. Bhutan spent his days in a simple rotation. In the morning, he climbed onto a flat stone at the pond's edge and sat in the sun. By midday, he slipped back into the water and floated among the lily pads. In the afternoon, he ate whatever the pond provided, slowly and without urgency. In the evening, he settled into the mud at the bottom of the pond and rested there until morning. He did this every day, with no variation and no apparent dissatisfaction. The human students at the school, meanwhile, filled their days with effort. They rose before dawn to sit in long sessions, spent their afternoons studying difficult texts, and measured their progress with anxious precision. Many of them kept private tallies of how their concentration compared to the student beside them, or how their understanding measured against the masters described in old books. A student named Taku was more troubled by these comparisons than most. 3 years at the school had not brought him the clarity he expected. His meditation was inconsistent. Some days were calm, others were storms. He still lost his temper over small things, and still felt confused by teachings that other students seemed to grasp without difficulty. One afternoon, Taku sat by the pond feeling sorry for himself. Bhutan had climbed onto his stone and was sitting in the sun, his eyes half closed, his ancient legs stretched behind him. There was something about the tortoise's stillness that bordered on offensive. Here was a creature with no practice, no study, no teacher, and no ambition whatsoever, and he seemed more at ease than anyone Taku had ever met. Master Fumi happened to walk past and noticed Taku staring at the tortoise with an expression halfway between envy and frustration. "What is troubling you?" Fumi asked. "Master," Taku said, "I have spent 3 years trying to find peace through practice. That tortoise has never meditated a single moment in his life. Yet he sits there perfectly content while I struggle to sit still for half an hour. It does not seem fair." Fumi looked at Bhutan for a while. "What makes you certain he has not found what you are looking for?" "He is a tortoise, Master. He cannot think about awareness or practice mindfulness or contemplate the nature of self." "Watch him more carefully," Fumi suggested. "When Bhutan is sitting in the sun, is he wishing he were swimming?" "No. He appears completely absorbed in sitting. When he eats, does he rush through his food so he can get back to sunning himself?" "No. He eats as though eating were the only activity in the world. When he rests at the bottom of the pond, does he lie awake reviewing his day or planning tomorrow?" Taku almost laughed. "No. He simply rests." Fumi nodded. "Bhutan does one thing at a time, and he does it completely. He does not add a second layer of thinking about what he is doing. He does not measure his current state against some better state he believes he should be achieving. When he is warm, he is only warm. When he is hungry, he is only hungry. When he is still, he is only still." Taku watched Bhutan on his stone. The tortoise had not moved. His breathing was so slow it was barely visible, a faint rise and fall along his shell. "But surely," Taku said, "there must be more to understanding than simply being like a tortoise." "What you are calling understanding," Fumi replied, "is your original condition. It is not something you create through effort or study. It is what is already here, before you start adding effort and study on top of it. Bhutan has never lost contact with this condition because he never learned to believe it was missing. Taku returned to the pond many times over the following weeks. He watched Bhutan eat, swim, sun himself, and rest, and he began to notice something he had been missing about his own practice. He had been treating meditation as a performance, an activity that could be done well or badly, measured and improved. Bhutan treated existence as something that simply happened, requiring neither evaluation nor commentary. Slowly, without forcing the lesson, Taku began to bring this simplicity into his own sitting. He stopped checking the clock. He stopped comparing today's session to yesterday's. When a thought arose, he let it be a thought, not evidence of failure or success. When his body was uncomfortable, he shifted without guilt. When his mind was quiet, he did not congratulate himself, and when it was loud, he did not despair. The shift was small from the outside, but inside it was as though a hand that had been gripping something for years had finally opened. A natural ease settled over his days, not because he had achieved anything new, but because he had stopped demanding that each moment justify itself. Months later, newer students noticed that Taku had a quality about him that was hard to name. He moved without hurry. He spoke without performing. He seemed comfortable whether a day went well or badly. When they asked him what had changed, he would nod toward the pond and say, "My best teacher never said a word. He just sat on a rock and showed me what it looks like when you stop keeping score." This gentle story points at something many of us do without realizing it. We add a running commentary to our own experience. We narrate, evaluate, compare, and judge every moment as it passes. Is this a good moment or a bad one? Am I doing well or poorly? Should I be further along than this? This commentary is so constant that we forget it is there. It becomes the background noise of being human, a voice that never stops measuring our lives against some standard it invented. And this measuring is exhausting, especially at night, when the voice has nothing left to measure except itself. Bhutan the tortoise lives without this overlay. When he is resting, he does not wonder whether he is resting correctly. When he is eating, he does not calculate whether he deserves the food. This is not because he is simple. It is because he has never learned the habit of self-narration that makes human life so tiring. You do not need to become a tortoise to benefit from this teaching. You only need to notice, here and there, the voice that runs alongside your experience, describing it, grading it, comparing it to how things were yesterday or how they should be tomorrow. This voice feels necessary, as though without it you might miss something important. But the truth is the opposite. The commentary is what makes you miss things. It stands between you and the raw simplicity of being alive, in a body, in a room, in the dark. The experience itself, the warmth of the blanket, the weight of your body against the bed, the slow rhythm of your breathing, none of this requires narration to be real. It is already happening, fully and completely, without any help from the voice that wants to describe it. As sleep draws closer tonight, you can experiment with letting the commentary rest. When a thought arises to evaluate how you are doing, whether you are relaxing quickly enough, whether sleep is coming soon enough, whether this moment is peaceful enough, you can notice that thought and let it float past without responding to it. What remains when the narration quiets is the same simple presence that Bhutan has been demonstrating on his stone all along. Warm when warm, tired when tired, here when here. Nothing more required, Allow your attention to rest now on whatever is most simple and present. The feeling of the surface beneath you, the weight of your own body, held and supported. There is nothing to figure out and nothing to prepare for. The next part of our journey will be here when you are ready for it. Let us pause for a moment before we continue our journey together. A ferryman named Jiro had spent most of his life on the same stretch of river, carrying people and goods across the water in a flat-bottomed boat he had built with his own hands. He knew the river's moods the way a farmer knows his fields. He could read the current by its color, predict the weather by the way the surface moved, and navigate the crossing, even in fog, by the sound the water made against the banks. Jiro had recently taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Hana, who had come from a village further upstream. Hana was strong, willing, and a quick learner with the oar, but she had one difficulty that no amount of river skill could solve. She could not tolerate waiting, and waiting was about to become unavoidable. In the second week of Hana's apprenticeship, the autumn rains arrived. Not the ordinary rains that swelled the river for a day or two and then passed, but the kind that settled in and stayed. The sky closed over like a lid, and the water rose until the crossing was too dangerous to attempt. Jiro pulled the boat onto high ground, secured it with ropes, and told Hana they would wait. The first day was manageable. Hana busied herself mending rope and oiling the oarlocks. But by the second day, with the rain still falling in grey sheets and the river running brown and fast below them, she began to pace the small shelter where they waited. "Master Jiro," she said, raising her voice over the drumming on the roof. "This is unbearable. I came here to learn the river, not to sit and watch it flood. I was supposed to visit the village market today. We are running low on lamp oil. When will this end?" Jiro, who had been sitting quietly near the doorway with his eyes half closed, opened them and smiled. "Come sit with me," he said, "and listen to the rain." "Listen to it?" Hana replied. "How can I ignore something this loud?" "I did not say ignore it. I said listen." Hana sat reluctantly beside the old ferryman. At first, all she could hear was the hammering of water on wood and stone, a wall of sound that seemed designed to make thinking impossible. It grated on her the way a barking dog grates on someone trying to sleep. "What do you hear?" Jiro asked. "Noise. Chaos. A ruined week. Listen past your opinion of it," Jiro said gently. "Listen to what the rain itself is doing." Hana tried. She stopped arguing with the sound and began to actually attend to it. Gradually, something shifted. The hammering separated into layers. There was the sharp tap of drops on the wooden roof, the softer hiss of rain on leaves, the low murmur of water running off the hillside into the river below. Each layer had its own rhythm, and the rhythms wove together into something that was, she had to admit, not entirely unpleasant. "The rain is not angry," she said after a while. "It is just rain." "Yes," Jiro said, "and the river is not punishing us. It is just full." By the third morning, with the rain still falling and the river still too high, something happened to Hana that she did not expect. Instead of fighting the weather in her mind, she began to settle into the rhythm of waiting. The drumming on the shelter roof, which had maddened her 2 days ago, now felt almost soothing, a steady pulse she could breathe alongside. She watched the patterns the water made as it streamed off the eaves, each thread of water splitting and joining and splitting again, endlessly varied, endlessly the same. She sat with Jiro in comfortable silence, coiling rope by feel while the grey light held steady around them. That evening, Hana realized she had stopped counting the days. She no longer knew whether she wanted the rain to end or not. The question had simply become irrelevant. When the rain finally eased on the fourth morning and the river began to drop, Hana felt something close to disappointment. The day she had first seen as a prison had become unexpectedly rich. "Master," she said as they carried the boat back to the water's edge, "I think I understand now. The rain was never the problem. My argument with the rain was the problem." Jiro set the boat down at the water's edge and paused to watch the clearing sky. The river was still fast but no longer angry. In a day, perhaps two, it would be crossable. "Yes," he said. "A river teaches this lesson every season, if you are willing to learn it. You can spend your strength fighting what is already here, or you can find the rhythm inside it and let it carry you. I have been on this water for 40 years, and the river has never once changed its mind because I was unhappy with it." In the years that followed, Hana often thought of those rainy days when difficult situations arose. When a crossing turned rough, or a passenger grew angry, or the river did something she had not planned for, she would remember the rain and ask herself a simple question. Am I fighting what is here, or am I listening to it? When she eventually took over the ferry and trained her own apprentice, she would tell them, "The river does not care about your schedule. Learn its rhythm and it will teach you things your schedule never could." This story touches on a distinction that sounds simple but changes everything when it is understood. There is a difference between what happens and what we add to what happens. The rain fell. That was one thing. Hana's frustration about the rain, her mental argument with the weather, her impatience and resentment, that was something else entirely, something she was generating on her own. Zen practice calls this second layer of reaction optional suffering. The rain itself was neutral. It was not aimed at Hana. It was not a punishment or an obstacle. It was water falling from the sky, the same water that filled the river she loved and made her livelihood possible. Her suffering came not from the rain but from her insistence that the rain should not be happening. This pattern repeats itself in nearly every area of life. Something happens that we did not choose, a difficult conversation, an unexpected change of plans, a body that aches, a night that will not bring sleep, and we add a layer of resistance on top of it. We tell ourselves it should not be this way, that something is wrong, that we cannot bear it. This resistance is often more exhausting than the original difficulty. When Hana stopped resisting the rain and started listening to it, nothing about the external situation changed. The rain still fell. The river was still too high to cross. She was still stuck in a small shelter with dwindling lamp oil and no way to reach the village. Every practical problem remained exactly where it was. But her experience of those facts transformed completely. The facts had not moved. She had. And the place she moved to, a place of acceptance rather than argument, turned what had felt like imprisonment into something closer to an unexpected retreat. She did not enjoy the inconvenience. She simply stopped adding a second layer of suffering on top of it, and what remained was bearable in a way that her resistance had never allowed. Tonight, when something arises that your mind wants to argue with, a sound outside, a restless feeling in your body, a worry that will not settle, you might try Hana's approach. Instead of pushing against it, listen to it. Not to solve it or make it go away, but to hear what it actually is beneath your opinion of it. Often what remains, once the resistance is removed, is surprisingly bearable. Sometimes it is even beautiful. And in that softening, without any effort on your part, rest begins to find its way back to you. The tea stall at the center of the old market square had been run by the same family for 3 generations. The current owner, a man named Masa, served tea from before dawn until well after dark, 7 days a week. His stall sat at the noisiest intersection in the market, where the cloth merchants called out their prices, the metal workers hammered, children chased each other between the stalls, and carts clattered over the cobblestones at all hours. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the least peaceful places in the province. A monk named Yuki, traveling between monasteries, stopped at Masa's stall for a cup of tea. He had intended to stay for an hour. He stayed for 3 days. He had been studying meditation for several years and had grown accustomed to the careful silence of monastery life. The noise of the market was, at first, almost physically painful to him. But what puzzled Yuki more than the noise itself was the man serving his tea. Masa moved through the chaos of the market with an ease that Yuki had rarely seen even among experienced practitioners. His hands were steady as he poured. His face was calm. His attention seemed to rest on whatever was directly in front of him, undisturbed by the shouting, hammering, and clatter that surrounded him on every side. "Masa," Yuki said on the second evening, after the market had finally quieted. "I have been watching you for 2 days, and I do not understand what I am seeing. I trained for years in a silent monastery, and loud sounds still scatter my concentration. You work in the noisiest place I have ever been, and you seem more settled than most monks I know. How is this possible?" Masa laughed as he wiped down his counter. "I have no training, monk. I just make tea. But the noise does not disturb you." "How?" Masa thought about this for a moment, as though the question had never occurred to him. "When I was young and first took over the stall from my mother, I hated the noise. I spent years wishing the market were quieter, wishing my stall were somewhere else, wishing the metal workers would move to another street. I was miserable. What changed? One night, when the market was louder than usual with a festival crowd, I was lying on my mat, behind the stall, unable to sleep, and something occurred to me. I was fighting against the one thing that would never change. A market is loud. That is what a market is. I was like a man standing in a river complaining about being wet." Yuki leaned forward. "So I tried something different," Masa continued. "Instead of hearing the market sounds as interruptions, I began to hear them as music. The rhythm of footsteps on the cobblestones, the pattern of the metalworker's hammer, the way voices rise and fall in conversation like instruments in an ensemble. Instead of resisting what I heard, I began to let it all pass through me, the way this stall lets the whole market pass by without keeping any of it. The sounds arrive, they move on, and I remain." That night, Yuki sat in the stall after Masa had gone to sleep, experimenting with what he had heard. The market was quieter now, but not silent. Dogs barked somewhere to the east. A night watchman called the hour in a low, carrying voice. Somewhere nearby, a door opened. A murmur of conversation spilled out, and the door closed again. Insects sang from the gutters. A cart wheel creaked on distant cobblestones. At first, Yuki did what he always did. He tensed against the sounds, holding himself apart from them, wishing for the deep silence he was used to. But then he tried what Masa had described. He stopped bracing and started receiving. The shift was not dramatic. The sounds did not become pleasant or disappear, but something in Yuki's body released. The muscles that had been bracing against the noise let go, and in their letting go, he found a quality of quiet that did not depend on the absence of sound. It was an inner settling that could hold steady regardless of what his ears were receiving. Before leaving the market on the third morning, Yuki asked Masa whether he had ever considered studying at a monastery. Masa smiled as he measured leaves into his pot. "Every cup of tea is my practice," he said. "Every customer is my teacher. Every sound in this market is a bell calling me back to where I am. Why would I go somewhere else to find what is already here?" When Yuki returned to his monastery, his fellow monks noticed something different about his meditation. He no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. A door closing, a bird calling, another student coughing. None of these broke his sitting the way they once had. When they asked what had changed, he told them about 3 days at a tea stall in the loudest market square he had ever visited. "The quietest man I ever met," Yuki would say, had never sat in meditation a single day in his life. "He just made tea in a noisy market and discovered something that took me years to find. You do not need the world to be silent in order to hear yourself." Most of us carry a belief, often without knowing it, that peace requires specific conditions. A quiet room, an empty schedule, the absence of difficulty. We treat peace as something fragile, something that can only survive in a protected environment, and we spend a great deal of energy trying to arrange that environment before we allow ourselves to rest. Masa's life was a gentle refutation of this belief. He had no quiet room, no empty schedule, and no absence of difficulty. What he had was a willingness to stop requiring the world to be different before he allowed himself to feel at ease in it. This shift, from demanding silence to finding stillness within sound, is not a technique to be mastered. It is more like a relationship to be changed. When sound is the enemy, every noise is an intrusion. When sound is simply part of what is present, it loses its power to disturb. The sounds themselves have not changed. Your stance toward them has. This is especially freeing at night. For many of us, any stray sound at night becomes evidence that rest is impossible. A car passing, a neighbor's voice, the house settling on its frame. Each one becomes a small emergency that the mind must process before it will let go. Think for a moment about the times you have slept most deeply. Not all of them were silent. Perhaps you fell asleep to the sound of rain on a window, or on a long drive with the hum of the road beneath you, or in a room where someone you trust was moving quietly nearby. In each of those moments, sound was present, but resistance was not. Your mind had decided, without being asked, that these sounds were safe, and in that decision it let go. The sounds of night can become what the market sounds became for Masa. Not interruptions, but a kind of accompaniment, like the low drone of bees behind a conversation. A car passing outside. The creak of a settling house. The distant bark of a dog. None of these need to stop for you to rest. You only need to stop needing them to stop. Master Tomo had spent decades building a monastery known for its discipline and rigor. His students rose before dawn, sat in motionless meditation for hours, and moved through their daily tasks with slow, measured precision. Tomo himself had devoted 30 years to the cultivation of inner stillness through the careful elimination of unnecessary movement. He believed that peace and motion were opposites, and that true understanding came from learning to be perfectly, completely still. One autumn afternoon, a traveler arrived at the monastery asking for shelter. Her name was Sachi, and she made her living performing martial arts demonstrations at festivals and gatherings throughout the country. She was polite and unassuming, but Tomo could see from the way she moved, fluid, balanced, every step placed with unconscious precision, that she was someone whose body had been trained to a very high level. After the evening meal, Sachi asked if she might practice her forms in the monastery courtyard. Tomo agreed, curious despite himself. What followed was unlike anything the monastery had seen. Several students had gathered in the courtyard to watch, expecting something brief and unremarkable. Instead, Sachi moved through a long sequence of forms, flowing from one position to the next without pause. Her arms swept wide and turned inward, her feet shifted and planted, her body spun low and rose again in continuous motion. Some movements were slow and deliberate, others sharp and powerful, but the transitions between them were seamless, as though the entire sequence were a single gesture that had been unfolding since before she began. The students watched in silence. A few of them had studied martial arts as young men, and they could see the precision in her footwork, the controlled release of energy in each strike. But what held them was not her skill. It was something else entirely. But what stopped Tomo where he stood was her face. He had expected exertion, concentration, perhaps the tight focus of a performer at work. Instead, despite the vigorous activity, her expression held a quality of deep calm. Her gaze held a quality of deep attention without any strain in it. Her breathing never quickened. At the center of all this motion, something remained absolutely, impossibly still. When Sachi finished, she stood quietly for a moment, not even winded. In that stillness after movement, Tomo felt a quality of presence radiating from her that equaled anything his decades of disciplined sitting had ever produced. "How do you hold such calm while moving that way?" he asked, and the question came out with genuine bewilderment, because it contradicted everything he had built his practice around. Sachi considered this. "You have spent years removing movement to find stillness," she said. "I have spent years finding the stillness that lives at the center of movement. They are not different things. They are two ways of looking at the same thing. But surely that kind of physical intensity must create agitation in the mind." Sachi tilted her head. "Your own mind right now," she said. "You have been sitting calmly all evening. Is it entirely still?" Tomo had to admit it was not. Thoughts moved through his awareness constantly, even during his most disciplined sitting. "Think of a wheel," Sachi said. "When it turns, the rim moves quickly. But at the very center, there is a point that does not move at all, no matter how fast the rim spins. My body is the rim. My awareness is the hub. I do not need the rim to stop in order to be still. I only need to know where the center is." Sachi left the following morning, continuing her travels with the same unhurried ease with which she had arrived. But the conversation stayed behind. That night, Tomo sat in his usual place for evening meditation and found that something had come loose in his certainty. All his life he had believed that stillness was a thing you built by removing motion, the way you build silence by removing sound. Sachi had shown him that stillness was not something built at all. It was something discovered, and it could be discovered anywhere. He found himself wondering whether his lifelong commitment to outer stillness had been a wall as much as a door. He experimented cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He tried walking at a normal pace through the monastery grounds while holding the same quality of awareness he cultivated in sitting. Then he tried it while chopping vegetables for the evening meal. Then while carrying water uphill from the spring, his legs working, his breathing heavy, and yet the center, somehow, undisturbed through all of it. To his surprise, the inner stillness did not break. It had never depended on outer stillness at all. He had simply assumed it did, and the assumption had become a wall he built around something that needed no walls. Over the months that followed, Tomo began to teach differently. He still valued sitting meditation, but he no longer treated it as the only doorway to calm. His students learned to find the unmoving center in every activity, sweeping, walking, carrying water, even during lively conversation. The monastery became both more active and more peaceful, which would have seemed like a contradiction to the old Tomo, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. When students asked him what had changed his teaching, he would describe a single evening in the courtyard with a traveling practitioner who had shown him something decades of sitting had missed. "I thought I was building a house for stillness," he would say, "and all along, stillness had no need of a house. It was the ground the house was standing on." This story asks a question worth sitting with. If peace depends on perfect conditions, how much of your life actually qualifies? How many hours in a day are truly silent, truly free of demands, truly arranged exactly as you would choose? For most of us, the answer is very few. Perhaps a handful of minutes scattered across the day, if that. And if peace is only available in those rare windows, then we spend most of our lives waiting for something that almost never arrives. But the wheel does not need to stop for the hub to be still. The market does not need to close for Masa to feel at ease. The rain does not need to end for Hana to find rest inside the sound of it. Each of these stories has been pointing at the same thing from a different angle. The peace you seek is not behind a door that requires certain conditions to open. There is no door. It is present in every circumstance, closer than any condition, waiting only to be noticed. But if the stillness Sachi described is real, if the center of the wheel is always motionless regardless of how fast the rim is turning, then peace is not something the world can give or take away. It is always here, beneath the movement of thought, beneath the activity of daily life, beneath even the restlessness that sometimes visits us at night. The wheel is a very old image, and it is useful precisely because it does not ask you to stop anything. You do not need to slow your thoughts, silence your environment, or flatten your emotions in order to find the center. The center exists because the wheel exists. It is not separate from the motion. It is what the motion turns around. As you rest here tonight, you do not need to arrange perfect conditions. If your mind is active, that is the rim turning. If sounds reach you from outside, that is the rim turning. The center holds regardless. You can look for it, not by stopping what is happening, but by noticing what, in you, is not moving, even while everything else is. Something in you has been steady all day. Through every conversation, every task, every worry, and every small satisfaction, something has remained exactly where it was. That is the hub. You can settle into it now and let the wheel turn as it pleases. Allow the day to settle now, the way sediment drifts down through still water. There is no need to sort through any of it. Everything will find its own resting place if you leave it alone. Feel the slow pull of gravity holding you where you are, steady and sure. Let us pause for a moment before we continue our journey together. Kanta had come to Master Renji's stone-cutting workshop at the age of 17, eager to learn the craft. Renji was considered one of the finest stonemasons in the region, and an apprenticeship with him was difficult to obtain. Kanta had waited 2 years for the opportunity and arrived on his first day expecting to be welcomed. He was not. From the very beginning, Renji was blunt with his feedback in a way that left no room for comfort. When Kanta shaped his first block of stone, Renji examined it and said, "Your line wanders. You are not paying attention to the grain." When Kanta tried again, more carefully this time, Renji looked at the result and said, "Better, but you are still working against the stone instead of with it. You are forcing your idea onto the material instead of listening to what it wants to become." Day after day, month after month, the pattern continued. Renji found something lacking in nearly everything Kanta produced. His cuts were uneven. His angles were imprecise. His finishing was rushed. His understanding of the stone was shallow. Kanta, who had grown up in a household where love and criticism arrived in the same sentence and praise was given rarely, found the workshop agonizing. Each piece of criticism landed on old wounds. He began to believe that Renji saw him as a failure, that the master regretted accepting him, that he lacked some fundamental quality needed for the craft. The other apprentices seemed to receive the same blunt treatment, but most of them shrugged it off and returned to their work. Kanta could not. Each correction stayed with him for days, replaying in his mind at night when he tried to sleep. He would lie on his mat reviewing every comment, convinced that each one was proof of his inadequacy. After 6 months, Kanta had decided to go home. His confidence was lower than the day he arrived, and he could not see how this relentless correction would ever lead to anything but more correction. The night before he planned to announce his departure, Kanta was walking past the workshop when he heard voices through an open window. Renji was speaking with his oldest colleague, and neither seemed to realize the window was open. "How is the young one progressing?" the colleague asked. What Kanta heard next stopped him where he stood. The voice coming through the window bore no resemblance to the one he heard at the workbench each day. It was warm, unhurried, carrying something that sounded unmistakably like pride. "Kanta has a remarkable feel for the stone," Renji said quietly. "I have not seen hands like his in all my years of teaching. He senses the grain before his chisel touches it." "Then why are you so hard on him?" the assistant asked. "He looks crushed half the time." Renji was quiet for a moment. "Because Kanta does not yet know that his worth comes from inside. He looks to me for reassurance, the way a plant leans toward whatever light is nearest. Until he learns to stand in his own sun, he will always lean. And a stonemason who leans cannot cut a straight line. But the criticism seems to be breaking him." "I know," Renji said, and his voice carried real weight. "It is painful for both of us. But what Kanta needs most is not praise. It is the discovery that even when no praise comes, he can still stand. When he stops needing my approval to feel worthy of his work, the work itself will become his teacher. That is when his real training begins." Kanta stood outside the window for a long time, his planned departure forgotten. Everything he had interpreted as rejection was something else entirely. The blunt feedback was real, the information in it was useful, but the harshness he had felt was something he was adding on his own, a habit of interpreting correction as condemnation. The next morning, Kanta returned to his bench with a different posture, not in his body, but in his mind. When Renji examined his work and said, "The left edge is uneven," Kanta heard only the left edge. He adjusted it. The comment no longer felt like a verdict on his entire person. It was just information about a piece of stone. Over the weeks that followed, something shifted in the workshop. Kanta still received the same blunt assessments, but without the desperate need for reassurance underneath them, the words landed differently. They became information he could use rather than wounds he had to recover from. One afternoon, Renji examined the lintel Kanta had carved and stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. Then he nodded once and walked away. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, but Kanta noticed that it meant nothing more or less to him than the corrections did. His sense of his own worth had stopped depending on either one. When Kanta eventually became a master stonemason himself, he was known for the unusual gentleness of his teaching. Students remarked on his ability to point out errors without making them feel small. When they asked where he had learned this, he would say, "Someone once gave me the space to discover that I did not need anyone's permission to stand. The ground was always there. I just had to stop looking up long enough to feel it." This story points at something that runs deeper than the relationship between teacher and student. Many of us have built our sense of worth on a foundation of other people's opinions. We feel good about ourselves when we are praised and terrible when we are criticized, as though our value were a number that goes up and down depending on the last thing someone said to us. Kanta's discovery was not that blunt treatment is good for everyone, or that we should go looking for people who correct us. Most criticism does not carry the care that Renji's did. The insight is simpler and more personal than that. Our reaction to criticism reveals how much of our self-worth we have placed in someone else's hands. When someone else's opinion is the foundation, any negative word becomes a crack running through everything. This pattern often intensifies at night, when the day's interactions replay without the context that softened them. A comment from a colleague, a look from a friend, a silence where praise was expected. In the dark, each of these can grow into something much larger than it was, because the mind is no longer busy enough to keep the old pattern from running. As you lie here tonight, you may notice echoes of the day's judgments, real or imagined, still moving through you. You do not need to silence them or argue with them. You can simply notice that they have no power to change what you actually are. Like rain falling on a mountain, they make sound, they run off, and the mountain remains exactly what it was before they arrived. You are the mountain in this image, not the rain. What falls on you tonight, whatever was said or unsaid, given or withheld, slides away in its own time. It does not change the stone. A scholar of medicine named Hoshi had devoted the best years of her life to study. She had traveled to 3 different provinces to learn from the most respected healers, filling notebook after notebook with remedies, observations, and insights. Her collection of writings represented everything she understood about the body, about illness, about the subtle art of diagnosis. She carried these notebooks in a leather bag that never left her side. Hoshi thought of this bundle as her life's work made portable. When she met other scholars, she would reference her notes with quiet pride. When she encountered a difficult case, she would consult them the way a captain consults charts. Her identity as a healer was so deeply intertwined with this accumulated knowledge that she could no longer tell where the learning ended and she began. If someone had asked her who she was without her notebooks, she would not have known how to answer. The question would have felt like asking what a river was without water. One autumn, hearing of a master named Takeo, who lived in a remote valley and was said to understand the root of suffering itself, Hoshi set out on the long journey to find him. The final stretch of the journey required crossing a wide river by a small hired boat. The boatman warned her that recent rains had made the current unpredictable, but Hoshi was eager to arrive and pressed him to make the crossing. Halfway across, the boat struck something beneath the surface and tipped sharply. Hoshi grabbed for the gunwale, but the satchel slipped from her shoulder. She watched, helpless, as the leather bag caught the current and spun away downstream. The boatman steadied the vessel and brought them safely to the far bank, but the satchel was gone. Years of notes, years of careful recording, years of accumulated understanding, all of it dissolving in the brown water. Hoshi sat on the riverbank, soaked and shaking. She watched the brown water moving past and tried to calculate what was gone. 3 years of study in the northern province, including every formula she had learned from the herbalist in the mountain village. 2 years in the east, where she had recorded the bone-setting techniques of a healer whose hands could feel a fracture through the skin. A full year in the south, filling page after page with observations about fever, infection, and the slow language of chronic pain. All of it now pulp and ink dissolving somewhere downstream. She felt as though her own substance had gone with it. Without these notes, who was she? A woman sitting wet on a riverbank with nothing left to show for all of it. When she finally reached Takeo's dwelling, still damp and hollow-eyed, she could barely speak. "Master," she said, "everything I have learned is gone. Every note, every remedy, every observation from years of study. The river took all of it. I have nothing." Takeo looked at her for a long moment. Then his face softened into a smile. "Good," he said. Hoshi felt as though she had been struck. "Good? I have lost my life's work." "Tell me," Takeo said gently, "when you look at your own hand right now, do you see the blood moving beneath the skin?" Hoshi looked down, confused. "Yes. And if a child came to you tonight with a fever, would you know where to place your hand on her forehead?" "Of course. And the difference between a cough that will pass and one that carries danger, is that written in a notebook or does it live in your ear?" Hoshi was quiet. She could still hear the difference. She could still smell infection, feel the speed of a pulse, see the particular dullness in the eyes of someone whose body was failing. "Your notebooks held what you had written down," Takeo said. "But the part of you that knew what to write down, that is still here. The river took the container. It could not touch what was inside. But without those notes, how will I remember everything I have learned?" Hoshi asked. "You are remembering right now," Takeo said. "I have not asked you a single question you could not answer. The knowing is in you, not in the paper. It always was. The notes were a shadow of the thing itself, and you mistook the shadow for the substance." Hoshi remained with Takeo through the winter, but she did not spend her time rewriting what had been lost. Instead, she learned to practice from what lived inside her rather than what she had written on paper. Her deepest skill as a healer, it turned out, had never lived in any notebook. It lived in the quality of her attention, in her ability to listen to a body the way a musician listens to an instrument, hearing what is present and what is missing. The facts she had recorded were real and useful, but they had always been the smaller part of her gift. The larger part could not be written down, and so it could not be lost. When she eventually returned to her practice, those who had known her before noticed a change they found hard to name. She was lighter in the way she moved, quicker to listen, slower to reach for reference. She worked from the inside out now, trusting what she carried in her hands and her attention rather than on her shoulder. When students asked about her approach, she would say, "A river once took everything I thought I needed. What it left behind turned out to be everything I actually had." This story speaks to a particular kind of burden that many of us carry without recognizing it as weight. We build identities around what we know, what we have accomplished, what credentials we hold. We go to bed mentally polishing these things, worrying about maintaining them, measuring ourselves against others who seem to have accumulated more. Hoshi's loss at the river revealed something liberating. The deepest part of who she was had never depended on her collection. Beneath all the accumulated knowledge, beneath the carefully maintained identity of scholar and healer, there was something more fundamental. A basic awareness, a capacity for care, a simple presence that needed no proof or documentation to be real. Zen teaching has a name for this. It calls it what you were before you added anything to yourself. It is not something you build, and it cannot be taken. It is what remains when everything you have added to yourself falls away. And paradoxically, it is often the most capable, most perceptive, most compassionate part of you, because it operates without the interference of self-image. Sleep offers a natural opportunity to set down your collections temporarily. Not just the tangible things, but the invisible ones. Your achievements, your expertise, your progress toward your goals. These things may serve you well during the day, but they can become heavy at night, when the mind feels it must guard and maintain them even while the body asks to rest. Tonight, you can let them go the way Hoshi's satchel went into the river. Not permanently, not recklessly, but for these hours. What remains when the collecting mind rests is the same quiet awareness that has been here since before you started gathering. It needs no maintenance, no protection, and no improvement. It is already complete, and it has been waiting patiently beneath everything you built on top of it. The small school in the foothills had taken Master Akira 20 years to build. It was a modest place, but well regarded, and students came from across the province to study Zen practice there. Akira had planted every tree in the garden himself, repaired the buildings with his own hands, and personally guided dozens of students through years of practice. The school was not just his work. It was the physical expression of everything he valued. Among the local officials who oversaw the district was a man named Makoto, who had long viewed Akira's school with suspicion. Makoto believed that the monks were a drain on the community, occupying land that could be put to productive use and attracting idle young men who should have been contributing to the local economy. Over the years, his resentment sharpened into something more personal, a conviction that Akira represented everything Makoto despised about people who chose contemplation over commerce. One spring, Makoto used his authority to close the school. He revoked the land permit, ordered the students to disperse, and had the building sealed. The action was technically within his power, though others in the district considered it vindictive and unnecessary. Akira's students scattered to other monasteries. The gardens he had tended for 2 decades began to grow wild behind locked gates. The loss was devastating. Akira had not simply lost a building or a piece of land. He had lost the community he had built, the students he had guided, the garden he had planted tree by tree. For months after the closure, he struggled with an anger so intense it frightened him. During meditation, instead of finding stillness, he would replay Makoto's actions over and over, imagining confrontations, composing arguments, rehearsing the things he wished he had said. His sleep became shallow and broken, haunted by the image of his sealed garden growing tangled behind its locked gate. One night, after another sleepless stretch spent turning over his resentment, Akira had a realization that cut through everything else. This anger is doing what Makoto could not, he thought. Makoto closed my school, but he could not touch my mind. I am the one allowing his actions to occupy my thoughts every night. He is probably sleeping peacefully while I torment myself in his name. The insight did not dissolve what he felt, but it changed its shape. Akira began to see that his bitterness was not strength or justice. It was a continuation of the harm, extending Makoto's reach into territory the official had never actually entered. But the grievance felt earned. The school had been taken unfairly. His students had been scattered through no fault of their own. The garden he loved was dying behind a locked gate. How could he set down a grievance that had every right to exist? Akira sat with this question for weeks. He did not try to force the feeling away, and he did not try to justify it. He simply stayed with it until something inside it began to shift. He did not need to forgive what Makoto had done. The actions were unjust, and seeing them clearly as unjust was not something he needed to abandon. What he could do was direct compassion toward whatever fear and smallness had driven a man to destroy something simply because he did not understand it. Makoto acted from his own suffering, Akira reflected. A man at peace with himself does not go out of his way to close a quiet school. His hostility came from something unresolved in him, some wound I will probably never understand. I can see that wound without excusing what it produced. This was not easy. It was not a single moment of release, but a gradual loosening, practiced day after day the way he had once practiced sitting. Whenever the heat arose, Akira did not fight it or follow it. He acknowledged it and then turned his attention toward the pain that must have existed in Makoto to create such destructive impulse. This was not pity or superiority. It was the same compassion he would feel for anyone trapped in confusion. Slowly, the grip loosened. Akira's sleep returned. His sitting practice grew quieter and more spacious than it had been in years, even the good years before the closure. He found a small room in a nearby village, resumed teaching whoever came, and discovered that what Makoto had closed was only the walls and the gate. What those walls had sheltered was still in him, untouched. 3 years later, Makoto appeared at Akira's door. The official was barely recognizable. He had lost his position in a scandal of his own making, and his family had turned away from him. He stood in the doorway looking like a man who had not slept in a long time. "Master Akira," he said, "I came here to ask for something I do not deserve to ask for. I destroyed your school. I scattered your students. I know what I took from you, and I know I cannot return it. But I am drowning in what I have done, and I do not know where else to go." Other students who had gathered around Akira in his new location were astonished to see the man who had caused their teacher such grief. Some expected Akira to turn him away. Instead, Akira helped Makoto to a seat with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "I set that weight down a long time ago," he said quietly. "Not because you deserved my forgiveness, but because I could no longer afford to keep carrying it. What you took from me was a school. What I was doing to myself every night was worse. "How can I forgive myself?" Makoto asked. "The same way I did. By looking at the man who did those things and seeing someone who was frightened and small, not someone who was powerful and evil. That man is not the whole of you. He was a version of you that could not see clearly. You can begin from where you are now." Makoto stayed for several weeks, working alongside Akira's students and beginning the long process of facing what he had done. When he eventually left, he was not the same man who had arrived. In later years, when students raised the subject of forgiveness, Akira would say, "Resentment is a fire you tend in your own house. Forgiveness is not about the person who lit the match. It is about deciding to stop carrying wood." This story draws a line that many people find difficult to see clearly. Forgiveness is not the same as approval. Akira never pretended that what Makoto did was acceptable. He never stopped seeing the injustice for what it was. What he released was the ongoing damage that his own bitterness was creating inside him, damage that Makoto's original actions could never have produced alone. The grievance we carry toward those who have wronged us often feels like a form of justice. It feels like holding someone accountable, like maintaining a truthful record of what happened. But Akira's experience reveals the cost of this record-keeping. The person we resent is usually not present to receive our anger. We are the ones who sit with it, night after night, turning it over, feeding it attention, losing sleep to a fire that warms no one. The practice of directing compassion toward the suffering behind harmful actions is not a technique for excusing those actions. It is a way of freeing yourself from the cycle of damage. When Akira looked at Makoto's behavior and asked what kind of pain would drive a man to destroy a quiet school, he was not offering Makoto an escape from responsibility. He was offering himself an escape from the prison of his own bitterness. This understanding is especially important for the hours before sleep, when old grievances often return with their full weight. We replay arguments, rehearse confrontations, carry tension in our shoulders and jaw on behalf of people who are not even present and may well be resting peacefully at this very moment. The grievance does not reach them. It only reaches us. Tonight, if the memory of someone who caused you harm returns to visit, you do not need to resolve the situation or reach complete forgiveness before you can rest. You can simply notice the weight of carrying it. You can recognize that the anger, however justified, is costing you something real right now, in this moment, in this body that is trying to rest. And you can gently set it down, not because the person deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve your sleep. Let your body soften now, starting wherever you feel the most held. The jaw, the shoulders, the space between your eyebrows. You have carried enough today. You have held enough. Whatever you were gripping, whatever you were guarding, it can wait until morning. The night asks nothing of you, but that you rest. Let us pause for a moment before we continue our journey together. Chiyo had been the monastery's archivist for 5 years when the fire happened. Her role was to care for the library, a quiet room at the back of the main hall where Master Koji's manuscripts were kept. Koji had spent the better part of 4 decades writing. His scrolls and bound notebooks filled every shelf, containing teachings, commentaries, poems, and letters that scholars traveled great distances to consult. The collection was irreplaceable, and its care had been entrusted to Chiyo because she was meticulous, responsible, and devoted to the old teacher who had written every page. One autumn evening, Chiyo was working late in the library, copying a passage by lamplight. She was tired. The day had been long, and her concentration was beginning to fray. When she finished her work and left the room, she forgot to extinguish the oil lamp on the corner table. She woke hours later with a jolt, struck suddenly with the sharp knowledge that she had left the flame burning. She ran to the library, but the lamp had already tipped, and the fire had spread across the nearest shelf. By the time help arrived, the damage was done. Nearly half of Koji's manuscripts were destroyed, decades of writing reduced to ash and curled paper. Koji himself passed peacefully that winter, of natural causes unrelated to the fire. But Chiyo could not separate the two events in her mind. She had destroyed half her teacher's legacy through a moment of carelessness, and he had died before she could make it right. What she felt settled into her like something physical, a heaviness behind her ribs that never fully lifted. In the months that followed, Chiyo turned on herself relentlessly. During meditation, instead of stillness, she replayed the evening over and over, checking the lamp she had not checked, carrying it to the door she had not carried it to. Her sleep was broken by dreams of burning paper. She lost weight. She withdrew from the other students. She began to believe that she deserved whatever suffering came to her, because her carelessness had cost the world something that could never be replaced. The new abbot, Master Satoshi, watched Chiyo disappear into herself month by month. He had spoken to her several times, trying to reassure her that the fire was an accident, that anyone could have forgotten a lamp, that Koji himself would not have wanted her to suffer this way. But Chiyo dismissed every attempt at comfort. She was convinced that the weight she carried was deserved, and that softening it in any way would dishonor the work that had been lost. One afternoon, Satoshi called Chiyo to his room and tried a different approach. "Chiyo," he said, "I want you to imagine something for me. Suppose another student had been caring for the library that night. Suppose she had been just as tired, just as devoted to her work, and the same thing had happened to her. Months have passed, and she is still refusing to eat properly, still unable to sleep, still punishing herself every hour of every day. She comes to you asking for help. How would you answer her?" Chiyo answered without hesitation. "I would tell her that it was an accident, that she did not intend harm, that Master Koji valued people more than paper, and that he would be heartbroken to see her destroying herself over something she could not undo." Satoshi nodded. "And would you tell her that she should carry this pain forever without relief?" "Of course not. She was doing her best. She made a mistake. People make mistakes. Then why do you hold yourself to a different standard?" Chiyo opened her mouth and closed it again. "You believe," Satoshi continued gently, "that your guilt is a form of respect for Koji's work. But think about what Koji actually taught. Do you remember what he said about excessive self-blame?" Chiyo's eyes filled with tears. He called it another form of selfishness. He said that when we drown in our own guilt, we turn the whole world into a mirror that reflects only ourselves. We stop seeing anyone else's need because our own failing has taken up all the room. So your guilt, which you believe honors him, is actually a violation of his deepest teaching. The words landed in Chiyo like a stone dropped into still water. In trying to honor Koji through her suffering, she had been doing the opposite of everything he stood for. His life's work was not the manuscripts. It was the living transmission of understanding from one person to another, and that transmission was being blocked by the very guilt she thought was keeping it alive. But how do I stop? Chiyo asked. The feelings come on their own. I cannot simply decide to forgive myself. You are right, Satoshi said. Forgiveness is not a decision. It is a practice, the same as sitting, the same as breathing. When the guilt arises, you do not need to fight it or believe it. You can meet it the way you would meet that student who came to you for help, with patience, with the understanding that she was doing her best with what she had. Over the following months, Chiyo practiced this with the same discipline she had once brought to caring for the library. When the feeling arose, she did not push it away or drown in it. She met it as she would meet a person in pain, with steady presence and without judgment. Slowly, she learned to recognize when she was feeling genuine sorrow, which had a purpose, and when she had crossed into self-punishment, which had none. The change was gradual. Her sleep returned. Her appetite came back. She began to re-engage with the community and discovered that her years inside that pain had given her something unexpected, a deep understanding of how to help others who were trapped in their own self-condemnation. When students came to Chiyo struggling with shame or regret, she knew exactly what they were feeling because she had lived inside it for years. She would listen carefully and then ask a single question. Would you talk to a friend this way? The answer was always no. And in that gap between how they treated others and how they treated themselves, the first light of self-compassion would begin to appear. Years later, when people asked Chiyo how she had found her way through such deep guilt, she would say, I learned that punishing myself was not loyalty. It was just more destruction, added to the destruction that had already happened. The lamp taught me that forgiveness is not letting yourself off. It is choosing to stop the fire from spreading. Self-forgiveness is often harder than forgiving someone else. We can extend compassion outward with relative ease, but when we turn it toward ourselves, something resists. It feels unearned, irresponsible, as though letting go of guilt would mean we do not care about what happened. Chiyo's journey reveals the flaw in this logic. Her guilt was not protecting Koji's legacy. It was preventing her from continuing it. The self-punishment that felt like devotion was actually another form of the destruction she was mourning, and recognizing this was the beginning of her healing. The distinction between regret and self-punishment is one worth understanding as the night settles around you. Regret is clean. It says, that happened, and I wish it had gone differently. It allows for learning and for change. Self-punishment is something else. It says, you are the kind of person who lets that happen, and you deserve to suffer for it. It does not allow for anything except more pain. If you are carrying something tonight, some mistake or failure that your mind wants to revisit, you might try Satoshi's question. Would you talk to a friend this way? Would you look at someone you cared about and deliver the verdict you are delivering to yourself? If you would not, then what is speaking is not truth. It is habit, learned long ago and repeated ever since. And habits, unlike truths, can be met with patience rather than obedience. You can offer yourself that patience now, tonight, in place of the verdict. Rest does not require you to have been faultless today. It only requires you to stop holding court. The monastery where Master Teru taught sat high on a forested ridge, connected to the valley below by a series of steep stone paths. In winter, when ice formed on the steps and snow packed itself into the gaps between stones, these paths became treacherous. Students were warned every year to move slowly, hold the rope rails, and watch their footing. A young student named Kazu took these warnings more seriously than anyone. He had grown up in a coastal town where the ground was flat and sandy, and the steep, icy paths of the mountain monastery filled him with a dread that went beyond reasonable caution. Every step was calculated. His hands gripped the ropes until his knuckles turned white. When the path narrowed or steepened, he would freeze entirely, unable to move forward or back until the fear released him. This fearfulness extended beyond the mountain paths. In meditation, Kazu was afraid of letting his mind go quiet, as though something dangerous might surface in the silence. In conversation, he measured every word to avoid giving offense. In his daily work, he checked and rechecked everything, paralyzed by the possibility that he might make an error that could not be taken back. Master Teru had observed this pattern for some time. One winter morning, the night snow had left the path slick and shining, and Teru invited Kazu to walk with him to the village below. Kazu bundled himself in extra layers and started down the path behind his teacher, moving with painful slowness, testing each step before committing his weight to it. Teru, meanwhile, walked at a normal pace, seemingly unconcerned by the ice. Halfway down, Teru's foot caught a frozen patch, and he went sliding. Instead of grabbing for the rope or bracing against the fall, Teru did something Kazu had never seen anyone do. He relaxed. His body went loose, his weight dropped, and he slid perhaps 15 feet down the slope before settling softly into a drift of snow. He was laughing when Kazu reached him. "Master," Kazu called, scrambling carefully down to where Teru lay. "Are you hurt?" That was so dangerous. Teru climbed to his feet and shook the snow from his shoulders. Dangerous? That was the most enjoyable part of the walk so far. But you had no control. You could not steer or stop. Exactly, Teru said, still smiling. And because I was not fighting the slide, I did not get hurt. When you resist a fall, your muscles tense, your joints lock, and the impact has nowhere to go. When you move with it, your body finds its own way through. He demonstrated with his hands, making a fist and striking it against his open palm. This is what happens when you brace. Then he let one hand slide along the other, guiding rather than stopping. And this is what happens when you allow. The energy is the same. The result is completely different. Kazu looked at the slope with deep unease. But surely being careful is better than being reckless. There is a difference between being careful and being afraid, Teru said. Careful means paying attention to what is here and responding to it. Afraid means bracing against what might happen and losing the ability to respond to what actually does. Over the following weeks, Teru began teaching Kazu a simple discipline he called moving with what comes. It started with physical exercises on the snowy paths, learning to shift weight rather than lock it, to roll rather than resist, to let the body find its own balance without the mind's interference. But the deeper teaching went beyond the mountain paths. In meditation, Kazu practiced letting thoughts arise without bracing against them. Where he had once tightened at the first sign of a difficult memory or an unwelcome feeling, he now tried to let it pass through him the way the slide had passed through his body, loose and unresisting. In daily work, he practiced responding to mistakes with adjustment rather than panic. When he dropped a bowl during meal service, instead of freezing in shame, he picked up the pieces and continued. When he pruned a branch incorrectly in the garden, he adapted rather than agonizing. Each small recovery built on the last. In conversations, he practiced speaking before his sentences were perfectly composed, trusting that imperfect words spoken with honesty were better than perfect words withheld from fear. The transformation was not immediate, but it was steady. As Kazu learned that falling did not have to mean catastrophe, his relationship with uncertainty began to change. He discovered that nearly everything that had exhausted him had come not from difficulties themselves, but from the hours he spent steeled against difficulties that had not yet arrived and might never arrive. One morning, several months later, Kazu was walking down the path when his foot met a frozen patch he had not seen. Where he would once have seized up in panic, he felt his body responding on its own, dropping its center, shifting with the slide, coming to a stop with something approaching ease. When he reached the bottom, Teru was waiting. "How was your walk?" the teacher asked. "Uneventful," Kazu said, and then smiled at the truth in that word. What would once have been a crisis had become simply another way of getting down the hill. When Kazu later became a teacher himself, students noticed his unusual calm in the face of setbacks. He would tell them, "Most suffering comes from bracing against what has already begun. When you learn to move with what comes instead of locking against it, you find that life carries you more safely than your resistance ever did." This story names a particular flavor of sleeplessness that many people recognize, the mind that will not stop preparing for things that have not happened. We lie awake, rehearsing tomorrow's difficulties, fortifying ourselves against scenarios that may never arrive, stiffening against a fall that has not yet begun and may never come. Teru's teaching suggests that this bracing is itself the problem. It does not make us safer. It makes us rigid, and rigidity is what turns a small stumble into a serious fall. The alternative is not recklessness or passivity. It is a willingness to respond to what actually happens rather than what we fear might happen. Tonight, you can practice this in the simplest possible way. Notice where your body is bracing, the jaw that is slightly clenched against tomorrow, the shoulders that are holding something they cannot put down until morning, the mind that is rehearsing a conversation that has not taken place. Each of these is a form of resistance against a future that does not yet exist. You are not required to force these places open. Simply noticing them is a kind of release. And in the space that opens when the bracing softens, rest finds room to enter. You have never once improved a situation by worrying about it at 3 a.m, but you have fallen asleep many times by letting go of something you thought you needed to hold. A scholar named Hiro had spent years traveling between schools of Buddhist study, gathering knowledge the way some people gather provisions for a long journey. He was thorough, disciplined, and deeply committed to understanding everything he could about the path before he walked it. When he arrived at the school of Master Yori, Hiro was surprised to find a teacher who offered no curriculum, no stages of development, and no guarantees of any kind. Other teachers had given Hiro clear frameworks. First you learn this, then you practice that, and after a certain period of effort, certain results will follow. Yori seemed to have no interest in this kind of structure. "Master Yori," Hiro said one afternoon, "every teacher I have worked with has given me a map of the path. Some maps are simpler than others, but they all show the territory and mark the destination. You offer nothing but open ground. How can I commit to walking when I do not know where I am going?" Yori looked at Hiro with a warmth that contained something playful. "Tell me," he said, "tomorrow morning, when you open your eyes, can you be sure you will see the evening?" Hiro paused. "No, but that is beyond my control. And what you understand about Buddhism right now, will any of it look the same to you a year from now? I hope not. I hope it will deepen. Can you be sure of that? No. And the people you love, will they continue to love you? Will your health remain as it is? Will your plans unfold as you have drawn them? Hiro had no answer for any of them. So you live every day, Yori said, surrounded by uncertainty in every direction. And yet you wake up and live your life fully. You eat, you study, you walk from one place to another. You do all of this without knowing how any of it will end. Why do you demand a guarantee from spiritual practice that you have never required from life itself? Hiro sat with this. Because I suppose I thought practice was the place where I would finally find certainty. A solid ground beneath all the shifting. Yori laughed gently. That is the mistake nearly everyone makes. Practice does not remove what you cannot know. It teaches you to walk steadily through it. What you are asking for is not a place the path leads to. It is the steadiness you develop by walking it. Over the months that followed, Yori introduced Hiro to what he called the discipline of not knowing. Instead of answering Hiro's questions directly, he would respond with questions that opened new territory. Instead of confirming that Hiro was making progress, he would ask, what would progress look like if you stopped measuring it? When Hiro brought him a carefully reasoned interpretation of a teaching, Yori would listen attentively and then say, that is one way to see it. What if it means something entirely different? At first, Hiro found this maddening. He had spent his life building structures of understanding, and Yori seemed intent on dismantling every one. But gradually he noticed something. Each time Yori refused to confirm a framework, the space that opened was not empty. It was alive with possibility. He was a scholar. Measurement and framework were his natural tools. But slowly, as he relaxed his grip on the need to chart his position, something unexpected began to happen. His practice became more alive. Without the pressure of matching his experience to a predetermined chart, each sitting revealed something he could not have anticipated. Each conversation with Yori took him somewhere nothing had prepared him for. One afternoon, while sitting with no agenda at all, Hiro experienced a moment of complete openness. The sense of a separate person watching an experience fell away. What remained was pure experiencing, without boundary or frame. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was unlike anything his years of systematic study had produced. When he described this to Yori, the teacher nodded. This came to you precisely because you stopped trying to make it come. You cannot schedule this any more than you can schedule falling in love or being startled by beauty. It arrives when the door is open, and the door opens when you stop trying to control what walks through it. So the guarantee I wanted, Hiro said slowly, was actually the thing keeping me locked out. Yes, certainty is a closed door. Not knowing is the open one. When Hiro eventually moved on from Yori's school, he carried with him not a map, but a compass. A willingness to face whatever direction presented itself without needing to know the destination in advance. He called this walking without a flaw, which sounded terrifying to those who heard it but felt, to Hiro, like the most grounded way of living he had ever found. Students who came to him wanting a map received the same answer. I cannot tell you where this practice leads. I can only tell you that if you bring your full attention to this moment, it will show you what the next one needs. The desire for certainty is one of the mind's most persistent habits, and it is one of the most common reasons people cannot sleep. We lie awake trying to know in advance how things will turn out. We want assurance that tomorrow will be manageable, that the decision we made was correct, that the future holds something we can bear. And because these assurances are impossible, the mind churns through the night, searching for a guarantee it will never find. Yori's teaching points to something counterintuitive. The certainty we crave is not just unavailable. It is the wrong thing to want. A life that could be fully predicted would be a life drained of everything that makes it vivid. The surprise of a conversation that goes somewhere unexpected, the relief of a problem that resolves itself in a way you never planned, the ordinary miracle of waking up to a morning you could not have predicted. When you find yourself unable to sleep because the future is uncertain, you might try holding this possibility. The uncertainty is not a flaw in your life. It is the texture of your life. It is the space in which everything interesting, meaningful, and alive takes place. You do not need to know what tomorrow holds in order to rest tonight. Consider this. You have met every previous day of your life with whatever it required. Some days were harder than expected. Some were easier. None of them were exactly what you predicted, and you met them all. You will do the same tomorrow, not because you have a plan for every possibility, but because meeting what comes is what you do. It is what you have always done. That is not a guarantee, but it is something steadier because it does not depend on circumstances being a particular way. It depends only on you, and you have been reliable company for yourself every day so far. Michi had built his fortune on the sea. His trading company operated a fleet of cargo vessels that carried goods between the coastal cities, and for years, the business had made him wealthy beyond anything his family had imagined. He was a careful planner who prided himself on anticipating every risk, calculating every cost, and leaving nothing to chance. 8 months ago, Michi had made a decision that shattered this self-image. He had invested heavily in a new shipping route that failed disastrously. A season of unexpected storms destroyed 2 of his ships and most of their cargo. The losses consumed more than half his savings and forced him to sell his finest vessel to cover his debts. Since then, Michi had been unable to rest. Each night, he lay in the dark replaying the decision. He reviewed the charts he had studied, the reports he had read, the conversations he had had with his captains. He found the moment where he had committed to the route and examined it from every angle, adjusting one variable at a time, imagining how things would have gone if he had chosen differently. The scene played on a loop that never reached a satisfying conclusion, because no amount of mental revision could change what had already happened. Hearing of a teacher named Naoki, who lived simply near the coast and was known for an unusual directness, Michi traveled to see him. He arrived exhausted and sat down heavily across from the old man. "Master Naoki," Michi said, 8 months ago I made a choice that has cost me dearly. I have lost ships, cargo, and nearly half of everything I own. Every night I go back to that moment and try to undo it in my mind. I rearrange the details, change the timing, choose the other route. But every version ends the same way, and I cannot sleep. Naoki listened with full attention. When Michi finished, the teacher did not respond to anything he had said. Instead, he asked, "What is the weather like outside right now?" Michi stared at him. "I have just told you about the worst thing that has ever happened to me, And you want to talk about clouds? Naoki smiled. Humor me. Michi glanced toward the window. It is clear. The wind is light. The sea looks calm. And you are breathing right now? Yes. Of course. Is the breath comfortable? Quick or slow? Despite his frustration, Michi paid attention. It is a little quick. Shallow. Probably because I am upset. And the surface you are sitting on. Is it comfortable? It is fine. Master, I do not understand how any of this matters when my life is in ruins. Your life, Naoki said quietly, is not falling apart. What is crumbling is the version of events you have been telling yourself every night since it happened. But that version and your actual life are not the same thing. Right now, the weather is fair. Your lungs are working. You are sitting comfortably in a warm room. This is your actual life at this moment. Everything else is a narrative your mind has constructed about things that are no longer happening and things that have not happened yet. Michi started to object, then stopped. He looked around the room. The afternoon light was pleasant. The air smelled of the sea. He could hear gulls through the window. His body, apart from the tension of his anxiety, was not in any distress. But the money I lost is real, he said, more quietly now. The ships are gone. Yes, Naoki agreed. Today, you have fewer ships and less money than you had before. Those are present facts, and you can work with present facts. You can make new plans. You can adjust. But that morning when you chose the route, the moment you committed, where has it gone? It is in my memory. And memory exists where? Michi sat with this. Here. Now. It is a thought I am having right now about something that has already ended. Yes. And every night, you climb into bed and recreate that moment, as if it were still happening. You spend hours inside a thought about something that has already concluded. Meanwhile, the actual night, which contains a comfortable bed and a body that is ready to rest, goes entirely unnoticed. Michi returned to Naoki several times over the following weeks. Each visit followed the same gentle pattern. Whenever Michi tried to discuss his past losses or future fears, Naoki would redirect his attention to something immediate. The temperature of the tea, the quality of the light, the sensation of his own feet on the floor. It felt, at first, like avoidance. But gradually, Michi began to notice something remarkable. In each present moment, met simply as it is, he had no problems. His difficulties existed only when his mind traveled backward or forward in time. When he stayed with what was actually here, right now, what he found was not crisis but quiet, ordinary sufficiency. He was warm. He was fed. He was breathing. The catastrophe lived entirely in his thoughts about another time. One afternoon, sitting with Naoki and watching the light change over the water, Michi laughed suddenly. Master, this is the strangest thing. Sitting here, right now, there is actually nothing wrong. Naoki smiled. Now you are beginning to see clearly. You can still plan for tomorrow and learn from the past. But you can only do those things from here, from this moment, which is the only place you have ever actually been. When Michi returned to his business affairs, something in his approach had changed. He still made careful plans. He still studied charts and consulted his captains. But the desperate quality was gone, the sense that every decision carried the weight of total ruin. He made his choices from the present moment rather than from a mental projection of catastrophe. and his judgment, freed from the fog of regret and fear, proved clearer than it had been since before the losses. His sleep returned as well, not because his problems had been solved, but because he had learned to leave them at the door of the present moment when he lay down at night. The past was finished. The future had not arrived. What remained was a body in a bed, a room in the dark, and the slow rhythm of breathing. About his recovery, Michi said only one thing, and he said it often. I spent the better part of a year living in a day that had already ended. A quiet old man by the sea taught me to come home to the only day that was actually mine. This story revisits a teaching from earlier in our journey, but from a different doorway. Where the first telling concerned a single mistake replayed, this one reveals the broader pattern, a mind that has learned to live everywhere except the present. Michi's suffering did not come from his financial losses, which were real but manageable. It came from the hours he spent each night inside a mental recreation of events that had already concluded. Naoki's method was not avoidance. He was not asking Michi to ignore his problems. He was pointing out that the mind's habit of time travel, backward into regret, forward into fear, is itself the source of most nighttime disturbance. The present moment, while not always comfortable, can always be met. Mental projections of past and future almost never can, because they are not real enough to be met. They can only be endured. This is a good teaching to carry into sleep. When you notice your mind reaching backward or forward, you can gently return it to what is actually here. The pressure of the blanket against your chest, the rhythm of your own breathing, the feel of the air wherever your skin is bare. These are real. They are happening now. And now is the only place where rest is possible. You are not required to settle the past or secure the future before you are allowed to close your eyes. You only need to arrive in this moment, which has been waiting for you all day, patient and undemanding, asking nothing except that you notice it. It has no opinion about how your day went. It does not care whether you solved every problem or left things undone. It is simply here, the same way the night is here, the same way your breathing is here, ready for you whenever you choose to arrive. Rest now in whatever is simplest. The rise and fall of your breath, the stillness of the room around you. Nothing in this moment requires your effort or your attention. Everything that needs tending will still be there in the morning. For now, you are free. Let us pause for a moment before we continue our journey together. Among the teachers in the eastern provinces, none puzzled visitors more than Master Shiro. Students who traveled long distances to study with him would arrive at his small monastery, expecting lectures, guided meditation, or at the very least a conversation. Instead, they would find the old master resting beneath a plum tree in the garden, apparently fast asleep. Some visitors dismissed him immediately, concluding that his reputation was undeserved and that he was simply an old man who napped too much. But visitors who remained for more than a day began to notice something they could not account for. Sitting near Shiro while he rested, their own thinking would slow and soften without any effort on their part. Questions that had seemed urgent would lose their sharpness. Agitation that had followed them for weeks would settle, gently and without fanfare, into something resembling peace. A young monk named Noboru arrived at the monastery determined to study with Shiro. Noboru had heard contradictory things about the teacher. Some called him deeply awake, others called him lazy. He intended to find out for himself. When he arrived, Shiro was exactly where everyone said he would be, lying beneath the plum tree with his eyes closed and his breathing slow. Noboru sat down nearby and waited for instruction to begin. An hour passed. Then 2. The afternoon light shifted. Birds moved through the garden. Shiro did not stir. By evening, Noboru's patience had thinned. He cleared his throat. Shiro's eyes opened, unhurried, and settled on Noboru with warmth. "Master Shiro," Noboru said, "I have been here since this morning, waiting. When does the teaching start?" "It started when you sat down," Shiro replied. Noboru looked around the empty garden. "But you have been asleep the whole time. You have not spoken once. And yet something in you changed while you waited. Who told you that words are the only way to learn?" Noboru felt a flash of frustration. "Master, I came for instruction. Techniques, explanations, guided practice. Sitting beside a sleeping man teaches me nothing." "Does it not?" Shiro asked. "Tell me something. While you were sitting here, waiting for me to perform, what happened to your thoughts?" Noboru considered this. They slowed down. "I was not thinking about much of anything." "And your body?" "Loose. Heavy. My body gave up waiting before my mind did." "Your breathing?" "It settled on its own." The garden was quiet. Shiro smiled. "So without anyone instructing you, without a single word of guidance, you became still, heavy, and present. What do you suppose did that?" Over the days that followed, Noboru returned each afternoon to sit beside Shiro beneath the plum tree. He felt foolish at first, as though he were wasting days he could spend in formal practice elsewhere. He kept a mental tally of what he was missing: lectures at other schools, guided meditation, the structured progression of study he had always depended on. But as the days passed, something in the quality of Shiro's presence began to work on him in ways he could not explain or resist. It was not that Shiro did anything. That was the confounding part. He simply lay there, breathing slowly, his body at rest among the falling blossoms. And yet Noboru's own mind grew quieter each day, as though it were learning something from the silence without being taught. Problems that had seemed urgent a week ago lost their grip entirely. Noboru noticed this with surprise one morning when he realized he had not thought about his spiritual progress in several days. The question of whether he was advancing, which had consumed him for years, had simply faded, not because it was answered, but because it no longer seemed to matter. Something more immediate had taken its place, the simple experience of being present, without an agenda, in a quiet garden beside a man who wanted nothing. He found himself breathing more deeply, sleeping more soundly, and moving through the monastery with a steadiness that no formal instruction had ever given him. One afternoon, sitting beside Shiro as the plum blossoms drifted down around them, Noboru said quietly, "Master, I think I see now. You are not asleep. You are showing me what remains when a person has stopped needing to be anything other than what they are." "And what does it look like?" Shiro asked, his eyes still closed. "It looks effortless. It looks like rest that has forgotten it needs to justify itself." Shiro opened one eye and laughed. "Now you are beginning to learn." When Noboru eventually left the monastery, people asked what the sleeping master could possibly have taught him. His answer was always the same: "The best teacher I ever had never spoke a word to me. He just lay under a tree and showed me what was left when you stopped performing. Rest is not the opposite of awareness. It is awareness that has finally set down its tools. This story invites a shift in how you might think about the boundary between waking and sleeping. We tend to treat them as opposites, awareness on one side and unconsciousness on the other. But Shiro's presence suggests something different. He was not unconscious beneath that tree. He was resting within awareness, not separate from it. His stillness had a quality of wakefulness to it that could be felt by anyone who sat nearby. This matters for your own approach to sleep tonight. You are not required to knock yourself unconscious or escape from awareness in order to rest. Sleep is not a departure from who you are. It is who you are when the effort stops, when the rehearsing ends, when the constant effort to be something in particular finally relaxes its hold. You can approach this transition gently, the way Noboru came to understand Shiro. Not as a task to complete or a condition to manufacture, but as a natural settling that happens when you stop requiring yourself to be doing, thinking, or producing anything at all. The awareness that has been with you all day does not leave when you sleep. It simply rests inside itself, the way Shiro rested beneath his tree, present and undisturbed. Mori drew the night duty at the monastery bathhouse. His job was to keep the fire going from midnight to first light, so the water would be hot when the monks came for their morning washing. Nobody wanted this shift. It meant sleeping through the daylight hours, missing morning practice, and sitting alone through the long silence between midnight and dawn with nothing but the fire for company. For the first several weeks, Mori struggled. His body pulled towards sleep during exactly the hours he needed to stay alert, and his mind, scrambling to compensate, filled itself with noise to keep from sinking. He would plan tomorrow's tasks, replay conversations from the day, compose letters in his head, worry about whether the fire was burning evenly. The noise served its purpose. It kept him from drifting off. But when the morning monk came to relieve him, Mori felt hollowed out, not from the missed sleep alone, but from the hours of internal chatter that had taken its place. One night, deep into his shift, something changed. It was around the third hour past midnight, the time when the body's need for sleep is strongest, and Mori's mind had simply run out of things to think about. The planning was done. The conversations had been replayed to exhaustion. The worrying had worn itself out. What remained was unlike anything he had experienced before. His mind was empty, but he was not drowsy. He was alert, but not alert to anything specific. And in that open awareness, sounds he had never noticed before began to emerge from the silence, the way stars emerge from a darkening sky. The gentle shifting of coals in the firebox, each one settling with a faint click. The creak of wood cooling in the bathhouse walls as the night air pressed against them. A cricket somewhere outside, its rhythm so steady it seemed to measure something. The slow count of his own pulse, patient and unhurried. For the first time on this shift, Mori felt completely settled. He was not trying to stay awake, and he was not fighting sleep. He occupied a place between the two that felt more restful than either one. His body was still. His mind was clear. The fire burned steadily in front of him, and he watched it with the kind of attention that requires no effort, the way you watch a sunset, not because you have to, but because looking away would mean missing something. This open quality held steady through the rest of the night. When the morning monk arrived at first light, Mori stood up and realized something he had not expected. He felt rested. Not tired, not depleted, but genuinely rested, despite having been awake the entire night. Over the following weeks, Mori explored this discovery with growing curiosity. Each night at the fire became a kind of experiment. He noticed that the open awareness he had stumbled into was not a rare event. It was available whenever he stopped filling his mind with content. The key, he realized, was not concentration. It was subtraction. When he stopped generating mental noise to keep himself awake, a quieter alertness emerged on its own, one that did not tire him and did not fade. It was both restful and sharp, like a still pond that reflects everything clearly, precisely because nothing is disturbing it. When the abbot asked Mori about the change others had noticed in him, he described what he had found. "I had been generating noise to stay awake," he said, "and the noise was costing me more than the wakefulness was worth. When the noise ran out on its own, what was left was not sleep. It was a kind of attention that needed nothing to attend to. And that turned out to be more restful than any sleep I had gotten during the day." When Mori eventually returned to a normal schedule, his nighttime discovery came with him. His sleep became deeper and more restorative because he had learned the difference between awareness that strains and awareness that simply rests. He no longer approached bedtime as a project to manage. He approached it as a return to the simple, open presence he had found beside the fire. Students who struggled with sleep would sometimes seek Mori out, and he would tell them, "The mind thinks it needs entertainment to stay present. But when it finally runs out of material, it discovers it was present all along, and that being present without content is the most restful thing it can do." That is where deep sleep starts. Mori's discovery points to something practical about the transition you are making right now. We often think of falling asleep as a kind of shutdown, a loss of awareness, a going away. But what Mori found beside his fire suggests that the movement towards sleep is actually a movement towards simpler awareness, not away from awareness itself. You may have noticed this in your own experience. The moments just before sleep often have a particular quality to them, a spaciousness, a softening, a sense that the usual boundaries of self are becoming less defined. This is not unconsciousness approaching. It is awareness returning to its most natural state, the state it was in before you started filling it with tasks and plans and commentary. Tonight, you can trust this process. You do not need to manage the transition from waking to sleeping any more than you need to manage the transition from day to night outside your window. It happens on its own, according to a rhythm much older and wiser than your plans for it. Your only task is to stop adding things to the awareness that is already here. The thoughts you generate to keep yourself company, the plans you rehearse to keep yourself occupied, the worries you turn over because you believe staying busy with them is the same as being responsible. These are all additions. What is here without them is simpler, quieter, and more restful than anything they provide. When you stop adding, rest arrives not as an interruption but as a homecoming. Yuta had been working on a question his teacher, Master Ayumi, had given him. The question was simple in its phrasing but had resisted every approach Yuta tried. He had thought about it during meditation, discussed it with other students, and spent hours staring at the ceiling of his room, turning it over from every angle. Nothing opened. The question sat in his mind like a locked box, and no amount of intellectual effort could find the key. The strain was beginning to affect his sleep. He would lie down exhausted, but find his mind immediately reaching for the question, probing it, testing new approaches, growing more agitated as each one failed. By morning, he was more tired than when he had gone to bed, and the question remained exactly where it had been. One evening, Ayumi noticed the circles under Yuta's eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "You have been attacking the question," Ayumi observed. "I have been working on it," Yuta corrected. "From where I am sitting, those look very different." "You are attacking. And this particular question does not respond to force. Then how am I supposed to answer it?" Ayumi was quiet for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. "Tonight, when you lie down, bring the question with you. But do not wrestle with it. Let it rest beside you the way a sleeping child rests beside a parent. Hold it gently, without asking it to do anything." Yuta was doubtful. He had spent weeks attacking the question with the full power of his intellect. The idea of simply lying beside it felt like surrender. But he was tired enough to try. That night, instead of the usual grinding, he held the question lightly in his awareness as he lay down. He did not push at it or demand answers. He simply let it be present, the way a sound is present in a room without anyone attending to it. Something shifted as he drifted towards sleep. The question did not disappear, but it changed shape. The hard, locked quality that had kept him awake for weeks began to soften. It was still present, but it no longer pressed against him. It lay beside him like a companion he did not need to entertain, keeping him quiet company in the dark. He noticed, as his body grew heavier, that the question seemed to be sinking with him, moving away from the bright edge of his thinking into some deeper place where he could not follow it with his conscious mind. He let it go. During the night, Yuta dreamed. He dreamed he was moving through a garden where each stone along the path bore a word from the question. As he walked, the stones rearranged themselves into sequences he had never tried. Connections appeared between ideas that his daytime forcing had kept apart. When he woke, the answer was simply there. Not as a thought he had constructed, but as something that had surfaced on its own while his conscious effort was asleep. The understanding was plain and whole, and he could not believe he had missed it through all those weeks of grinding. At morning practice, Ayumi saw the change in him immediately. "You received something last night," she said. "How did you know?" "The part of you that has been working on this question never stopped. But the straining, pushing effort was standing between the question and its answer. When you stopped forcing, the answer had room to surface. Sleep gives us this opening whenever we are willing to use it." Yuta began to practice what he privately called resting with a question. Where he had once treated sleep as an interruption to practice, he now recognized it as another form of working, one that happened below the reach of conscious effort. He found that tangled questions from the daytime would often come undone by morning, not through effort, but through whatever happens in the quiet hours when the waking mind finally lets go. Yuta found that this principle extended well beyond his formal practice. A disagreement with another student that had festered for days resolved itself one morning after a night when Yuta had simply held the discomfort before sleep without trying to argue his way to a resolution. A passage from a teaching text that had confused him for weeks became clear after a night when he rested with the confusion rather than fighting it. Ayumi noticed the change and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "You are learning to work with the night rather than against it," she said. "Most people treat sleep as a gap in their understanding. You are learning that it is part of the understanding itself." When other students asked about his approach, he would say, "Stop hammering at the lock. Set it down before you sleep, and by morning the door may be open. Some understanding only arrives when you stop reaching for it." This story suggests something worth trusting as sleep approaches. The intelligence that works through you during the day does not stop when you close your eyes. It changes its method. Where the waking mind works through logic, effort, and concentration, the sleeping mind works through integration, pattern, and release. Neither is superior to the other. They are partners in a single process. If you are carrying an unresolved question tonight, a decision you cannot make, a situation you cannot see your way through, you are not required to crack it open before you sleep. You can bring it with you the way Yuta brought his, not as a burden but as a quiet companion. Hold it without squeezing. Let it be present without demanding that it perform. The night has its own intelligence. It works with what you give it, in its own way and its own time. Your task is not to direct this process but to trust it, the way you trust a river to carry you without needing to understand exactly how the current works. If there is something unresolved in you tonight, you can set it down here. Not abandon it, not ignore it, but place it gently beside you as Yuta placed his question, and let the hours do what they do. Tomorrow may bring a clarity that tonight's effort could never produce, not because you tried harder, but because you finally stopped trying and let something quieter take over. There was a young monk named Kaito who had forgotten how to sleep. For months, he had tried every approach he knew. He adjusted his sleeping position, controlled his breathing, counted his exhalations, visualized peaceful scenes, and followed a rigid bedtime routine that left no detail to chance. None of it worked. The more effort he put into falling asleep, the further sleep retreated. Hearing of a teacher named Tetsu, who was said to have an unusual understanding of rest, Kaito made the journey to his monastery. He arrived looking exactly like what he was, a young man who had spent months locked in a losing fight with his own rest. "Master Tetsu," Kaito said when they first sat together, "I cannot sleep. I have tried everything. Breathing methods, counting, posture adjustments, visualization. Nothing gives me the rest I need. My mind races the moment I lie down." Tetsu listened with care, then said, "Before I can help you, describe what happens when you go to bed." Kaito described his routine in detail. He lay in a specific position, began a breathing pattern of precise counts, visualized a particular image, and then monitored his progress towards sleep, adjusting his technique if it did not seem to be working. "I see," Tetsu said. "Now breathe for me the way you breathe when you are watching something beautiful and have forgotten yourself." Kaito was confused by the request, but he tried. He imagined a sunset and let his breathing respond to the image. The breath that came was nothing like his controlled bedtime technique. It was natural, unforced, neither too deep nor too shallow. It simply was. "That is the difference," Tetsu said. "Your bedtime breathing is a performance. It keeps the performer awake. The sunset breathing is not a performance at all. It is what happens when you stop managing and start receiving. Sleep works the same way. The body has known how to do this since before you could walk, and it has never once needed your advice." Over the following days, Tetsu taught Kaito something he had never encountered before. Instead of techniques for inducing sleep, Kaito learned to prepare for rest and then release any attachment to the outcome. "Sleep is like a cat," Tetsu told him one evening. "Run toward it and it moves away. Sit still and pretend you are not interested, and it crosses the room to find you. The less you pursue it, the closer it comes." One evening, Tetsu demonstrated what he meant. He lay down on his mat and invited Kaito to observe. "Watch what I do," Tetsu said. I am not going to force anything. I am simply going to stop preventing what wants to happen. Kaito watched closely. Tetsu's breathing slowed on its own, without any visible effort to direct it. His face softened first, the muscles around his eyes and mouth releasing whatever they had been holding. Then his shoulders dropped. Then his hands, which had been resting on his chest, grew heavy and still. His body settled into the mat, the way water finds its level, not all at once, but gradually and completely, each part releasing in its own time. The shift from waking to resting was so gradual that Kaito could not find a seam. There was no moment where one state ended and the other began. It was like watching daylight fade. At some point the light is gone, but you cannot say when it left. What struck Kaito most was that even in sleep, Tetsu's presence carried a quality of calm awareness. It was not the blankness of unconsciousness. It was something gentler, a consciousness that had simply stopped working and started resting. Over the weeks that followed, Kaito practiced setting down his methods one by one. He stopped his counting, his controlled breathing, his visualization. Instead, he simply lay down and noticed what was already happening. The weight of his body on the mat, the sounds of the evening, the natural pace of his breath as it found its own rhythm without his supervision. The first few nights were difficult. His habits of control were deeply worn, and they did not want to be set down. He would catch himself counting without meaning to, or holding his breath in a pattern he had not chosen. Each time, he would notice, let go, and return to simply lying there. But gradually, over the course of weeks, something began to change. Sleep, which had seemed like an adversary he could never outlast, began to arrive on its own. Not every night, not always quickly, but with a steadiness that none of his methods had ever produced. And the sleep that came through this allowing was different in quality from anything he had experienced before. It was deeper, less fragile, and he woke from it feeling genuinely restored rather than merely less exhausted. One morning, after a particularly deep and restorative night, Kaito woke and lay still for a long time, noticing how different his body felt. The tension that had become his normal state, the clenched jaw, the shallow breathing, the restless legs, all of it was gone. Not suppressed or managed. Simply absent, the way pain is absent from a healed wound. He found Tetsu in the garden and sat beside him. I have been standing in my own doorway. The moment I stepped aside, everything I was looking for walked right in. Tetsu nodded. Your body has been doing this without you since the day you were born. It does not need supervision. It only asks that you step out of the way. When Kaito eventually returned home, friends remarked on the change in him. He moved more easily, spoke more quietly, and carried none of the frantic energy that had defined him before. Friends who asked what had changed got a short answer and a long smile. I spent months running after the one thing that only arrives when you stop running. This final story is the simplest of all the teachings we have shared tonight, and perhaps the most useful for where you are right now. Sleep is not a performance. It is not a test you can pass or fail. It is the most natural thing your body does, as natural as breathing, as natural as your heart continuing to beat while you read or listen or rest. Everything you need for sleep is already here. Not in a technique, not in a method, not in the right combination of counted breaths or visualized scenes. It is here in the simplest possible sense. Your body knows the way. It has been making this journey every night of your life, long before you had any plans for it and entirely without your instructions. Tonight, you can trust it again. Not because you have mastered a technique, but because the technique was never needed. What was needed was always simpler than that. A willingness to stop managing and start allowing. And so our journey together reaches its natural end, not because there is nothing more to say, but because the deepest truths have always lived beyond words. Everything you have heard tonight was already known to you. The stories, the teachings, the quiet observations about the nature of rest and awareness. None of them introduced something foreign. They only pointed at what has always been here, waiting beneath the noise of daily life for a moment of recognition. You do not need to hold on to any of it. These stories will continue to do their work in their own way, the way seeds do their work in soil, without being watched or managed. Some will surface tomorrow. Some may surface months from now. Others will simply settle into the way you move through your days, so quietly that you may never trace them back to this evening. For now, there is nothing left to do. The day has ended. Your body is at rest. Your mind has been given permission to stop performing, stop evaluating, stop reaching for what comes next. What comes next will arrive on its own, the way morning arrives, without anyone arranging it. Let your breathing find whatever rhythm feels most natural. It does not need to be deep or slow or measured. It only needs to be yours. Let your muscles release whatever they are still holding. Let the boundary between waking and sleeping soften until there is no boundary at all, just a gentle deepening, like a river widening as it reaches the sea. May your rest tonight be deep and untroubled. May you wake with the quiet clarity that comes from a night of genuine peace. And may whatever wisdom you touch tonight continue to unfold through you in the days ahead. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this time with us here at Midnight Monk.